We're so proud of him.
It's been a huge amount of sacrifice and time away from home, but the fruits of our labor are coming to fruition.
Now, with Doug is NASA astronaut Bob Behnken. He's the Joint Operations Commander for Demo 2. He previously flew on 2 shuttle missions, STS-123 and 130, and he also served a tour as the Chief of the Astronaut Office. Why don't we learn a little bit more about him?
When you go through the launch day preparations, there's a lot of moments that kind of stand out to you. One is the kind of the celebratory piece of it, which is that you're walking out of the suit up room and getting in the vehicle that's going to take you to the launch pad. When you close the hatch, that's really when Doug and I are in the vehicle, and it's our vehicle, and we're really in control of the mission at that point.
Test pilots tasked that man could fly into orbit around the Earth
when you are
and return live and well to talk about it.
There's always a balance of managing risk as you go forward to execute a test point and figuring out a way to collect the data. We hear a sound. Okay, is that sound an expected sound? Or we see a light, is that light an expected light? What's the source of it? Does it sync up with something else that's going on or not? So trying to dissect all of that in real time in your head is, a lot of things happen like that on launching of a vehicle.
From St. Anne, Missouri, he is an Air Force colonel and flight test engineer. He flew aboard Space Shuttle Endeavour twice. Introducing NASA astronaut Bob Behnken.
My career at NASA has kind of spanned a couple of decades at this point. I arrived with the class of 2000, went through the training program, primarily focused on the space shuttle and the International Space Station, learning those systems. Having launched a couple times on vehicles, the second time was definitely different than the first time. You can feel a little bit guilty of, hey, should I study one more thing, or is there one more piece of information I should get? Am I really prepared or not? So that's definitely different between where I was on my first flight and where I'm at right now.
I think for me personally, as a spouse, watching everything that Bob has put into this over the last 5 years, the dedication that he's shown, the perseverance is pretty special. For both of us, though, the way our minds work, it won't be until sort of the mission is complete that you have really a chance to savor it and celebrate it.
On a deeply personal level, I'm really excited that my son is going to get a chance to see me launch into space. Being an astronaut has been a little bit of an abstraction thing for him because he's seen me do it in old videos, but he hasn't seen me do it for real. And so I'm excited for him to see me launch into space. Really, my role on the Demo 2 mission is to make sure that we get this vehicle tested and evaluated so that we can move on to more operational missions at the International Space Station.
3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. Liftoff of the Falcon 9 and Crew Dragon. Go NASA, go SpaceX, Godspeed, Bob and Doug.
We've got a lot of objectives on board the vehicle that we need to accomplish to really make sure that it's good to go. We'll do everything from actually talk from the Dragon vehicle to a Russian Soyuz. We'll dig out all kinds of hardware that's stored in the nooks and crannies of the vehicle so that we have a good feel for how things are in place and getting them back in place. We plan to do all those things as just a part of our test mission.
Welcome to Bob and Doug. I will tell you, the whole world saw this mission, and we are so proud.
I'm looking forward to that moment when he enjoys the accomplishment, when he realizes we did this, we did a great job, we accomplished what we set out to do. Whenever he lets himself feel that and experience that success, that's what I'm really looking forward to for him. For me, I'm looking forward to when he touches down at Ellington in the NASA plane that brings him home again at the end of it.
I think that the thing I'm most looking forward to is actually ending up in the water safely at the end of the mission. I'm expecting a little bit of a little bit of vomiting maybe to happen in the end game. So when we get to that opportunity to do that, I'm looking for that kind of celebratory event for both of us in the water at the end of the mission.
So cool, great view on your screen. That's from a camera behind Bob and Doug. Bob sitting in the right hand as we see him.
Dragon in 2.5, 2 successful leak checks.
Dragon SpaceX, we see the same. Thank you.
So there's confirmation of a couple of great milestones. Forward hatch is closed, suit donning is complete. We just completed suit leak checks. Everything nominal. Bob and Doug just raising their visors, get a little bit more comfortable.
I love this view because it makes me feel like I'm in the back seat of Crew Dragon, just going along for the ride. We did have, as you mentioned, A-pass hatch closure during that brief video, as well as the beginning of suit leak checks. I've got a few milestones coming up. Next, we'll be looking for that vestibule depressurization, bringing that space down to a vacuum. That should be happening very shortly. Hopefully within the next 5 minutes, actually.
Yeah, so again, on your screen, left-hand side is spacecraft commander Doug Hurley. Right-hand side is spacecraft pilot Bob Behnken, and also joint operations commander. In front of them are the 3 touchscreen displays in the Dragon spacecraft. And with suit leak checks complete, the next major milestone, as you mentioned, Leah, is vestibule depressurization.
So you can see they're checking out all their screens. The crew will actually be monitoring during the departure portion of the flight. On the way up, they had a couple of opportunities to perform some manual flight tests by piloting the vehicle and checking those out and seeing how it would fly if you ever had to. But fortunately, it is an autonomous vehicle. So the goal is that the astronauts are along for the ride, there to monitor and there to step in case anything were to go wrong. But it should be an autonomous flight home. We're not stopping for any of those flight tests along the way.
That's right. Just trying to take a look here to see what the vestibule is currently pressurized at. Taking a look at the data, it's about 14.1 psi, so pounds per square inch. For reference, at sea level on Earth, we're at about 14.7 psi, and if you're about 1,000 feet above sea level, then you're actually at about 14.1. Just happened to look that up earlier today. It looks like we might have lost the camera feed, might be another handover.
Probably so. We are waiting for that vestibule depressurization to begin. We're getting calls from the crew that they're getting ready for that. So things are moving along smoothly. Everything is happening on time for an on-time departure from the International Space Station today.
Yeah, and that call will actually be the ground side. We'll do a couple of checks, make sure that we're go, and all of the data and telemetry on the Dragon side of the vehicle looks good, and on the vestibule sensors look good. Then there should be a call to the crew from the core, letting them know that that we're planning to step into commanding vestibule depressurization, and then we'll actually issue that command. For this command, we are in joint operations. So what that means is the flight director in Hawthorne, or in Houston at Johnson Space Center, the flight director of the International Space Station has mission authority for the mission. And any commands that we want to issue to the spacecraft will actually have to get permission from the flight director. And so some of those calls will be happening in the background before we actually begin that depressurization.
Dragon SpaceX for status. The ground has verified system reconfigurations for hatch closure are complete and they are nominal. The ground will step into vestibule depressurization shortly. And finally, control of cabin air temperature via your procedure 4.080 is allowed at this point, and note that the hex is currently configured for maximum cooling.
Okay, copy all, 4.080 if we need to change the temperature. Appreciate it.
And some words going up to the Crew Dragon crew from, as you mentioned, the core, the crew operations responsible engineer here on the ground at SpaceX. They spoke with the teams in Mission Control Houston and decided, yes, they are almost ready to begin that depressurization of the vestibule. This is the exact opposite procedure that we saw on the way up. And sounds like vestibule depressurization has begun. So as we mentioned, working to bring that space down to a vacuum in preparation for Dragon to depart today. That depressurization call coming at 3:04 p.m. Pacific.
And moving pretty quickly, data shows we're currently at about 12 psi in the vestibule. Just dropped below 12, and only less than a minute ago we were at 14.1. And should only take 5 to 10 minutes to drop down to that 5 psi holding point that Gary had mentioned earlier.
And that hold will be for 25 minutes while the teams make sure the depressurization is due to the actual removal of the pressurized atmosphere and not a change in the temperature inside Crew Dragon.
Yeah, a little bit of physics there. If you expand a gas, which is what's happening here, we're taking the gas in the vestibule and venting it away, and so taking the molecules in that vestibule and sort of expanding them out, the temperature tends to drop, and so we'll want to wait for that temperature to equalize, because as it warms up, the remaining gas will bump up a little bit in pressure, and that can look like a false leak from either the International Space Station side or the Dragon side. So we give it some time to equalize the temperatures, and once we feel confident that the pressure is stable in the vestibule, then we actually perform the leak check and look to see that we don't have a drop in cabin pressure on the Dragon side, as well as a rise in pressure in the vestibule.
And things are moving quickly. We are actually already at 8.5 psi, it's pounds per square inch, in the vestibule. And as you mentioned just a moment ago, we were at 14.1. So at 8.2 now, and then we'll be waiting for that 5 psi point where we'll do that 25-minute hold.
Yeah, and kind of wild to think, among the other fun facts I was looking up, so the pressure at Everest is about 4 psi. So that'll kind of give you a sense of this. The pressure in the vestibule right now would be about similar to you being at maybe like 12,000 or 13,000 feet.
Yeah, and very interesting. That's near the same pressure as in an EMU, or an extravehicular mobility unit, that the astronauts use when they go outside on a spacewalk. They keep that at 4.3 psi. That way they are more able to easily move their fingers and their joints, so that work outside isn't as difficult.
Something interesting to note on the extravehicular, or on the EMUs. So at that like roughly 4 psi, where you're not breathing the same mix of air that you would be breathing here on the ground. Here on Earth, we'd be breathing something like 70% nitrogen and then about 20-something% oxygen. You actually need the concentration of oxygen to be higher. So when you go to those lower pressures, those suits actually transition to oxygen, right?
And taking a look at the data, it looks like we are at 5.9 psi in the vestibule. So coming up pretty soon, we should be expecting that call of having reached that 5 psi level that we're waiting for that 25-minute check.
Mission controllers that you can see on your screen, specifically who we refer to as the systems officer, will be monitoring for the pressure. We'll also be looking for temperature checks on that area. The systems officer is actually responsible for the life support systems and thermal system on the vehicle, and so they're most familiar with that telemetry and able to make those calls for nominal leak check complete. And they'd also be responsible for checking that the vehicle configures into appropriate transition modes.
And I just heard that the initial depressurization of the vestibule is complete, looking at 5 psi, nearly on the dot.
So I think what we can expect next is a call from the core up to the crew to let them know that the thermal hold period is beginning. And then we will probably also hear when the leak check is complete and the results of that leak check. So we're kind of listening to the nets in the background. Just heard a conversation from the mission director prompting operators on next steps for start of this thermal hold period and then the leak checks. Bob and Doug really just sitting tight in the cabin at this point in their suits, able to monitor all this information from their 3 touchscreen displays in the vehicle.
Yeah, and we heard that we're about an hour and 20 minutes from the opening of the undocking window, so they get more than one chance today to undock. On the way up, we saw the astronauts really only had that single second that they had to launch so that they would line up perfectly with the International Space Station. It's a little bit different coming home. Those burns will really be what help us line up with our targeted landing site. Right now, looking at Pensacola and a scheduled splashdown tomorrow.
There's a view on your screen. Left-hand side is the International Space Station. So that's coming from Node 2, or the forward node. Looks like Commander Chris Cassidy taking a look down the PMA and sealing up the hatch. Probably checking the seal there, look like.
Yeah, probably checking it for FOD, or foreign object debris, making sure that there's nothing, even a minuscule hair, that could impair the hatches from getting a good solid seal. So it looks like another handover of our TEDRS satellite systems. Those are tracked. The flight controllers know when to expect those, and so they can target their communications with the crew and any of those operations around that as well.
And now would actually probably be a great time to kind of hear what the mission control team in Houston is doing and what's going on station side. Gary, can you give us an update?
I sure can, Shiva. We're seeing the same results of the vestibule depressurization. Went down pretty quick, but again, as you said, we're looking for that thermal stabilization before we perform the leak checks. We saw good leak checks from the crew's suit-up procedures. The suit's looking pretty good. And then we just saw Chris Cassidy aboard the International Space Station finishing out his closeout duties of the pressurized mating adapter. That was that long tube on the other side of the hatch that he just closed, putting some items there, getting ready for the next crew coming up later this year. He closed the A-Pass hatch and configured that for closure and taking some closeout photos and checking for any foreign object debris, and then eventually closed that Node 2 forward hatch. That'll complete Chris Cassidy's duties really aboard the International Space Station for today. The primary role of undocking monitoring actually goes to Bob and Doug, with Mission Control Houston flight controllers monitoring from the ground. Chris Cassidy will be able to go inside the cupola. The windows are the shutters of the cupola windows are scheduled to be shut, but he'll be able to open them for situational awareness, take some good closeout photos of Dragon departing. Right now, we're just, again, in a holding period for that vestibule depressurization, holding rock steady at 5 pounds per square inch, 5 psi. That is the final step. That is the final step, final check, really, for vestibule depressurization until we get down closer to vacuum. And then, of course, we have the go, no-go for undocking coming up in just about an hour, and then eventually we'll get to separation. Right now, scheduled for just after 6:30 p.m. Central Time, 4:30 p.m. Pacific Time. Everything looking good from the International Space Station side of things. Again, Cassidy's duties really wrapped up for today, closing both of the station hatches. With that, we'll continue to monitor this thermal stabilization, ready to continue depressurization of the vestibule coming up here shortly. With that, we'll pass it back over to you in Hawthorne.
Thanks, Gary. Appreciate it. On your screen, a view from that camera looking at Bob and Doug's console.
So when Dragon undocks today, it'll actually weigh over 27,000 pounds. We're looking at 27,600 pounds. Of course, in microgravity, that's nearly nothing. And they'll have about 3 days worth of food and snacks on board. So we're planning on them to get home tomorrow afternoon, well, tomorrow midday for us here on the Pacific coast. And so those 3 days of food and snacks are there just in case there were to be some weather crop up that wasn't expected, and they can remain in orbit for a couple of days after undocking and be perfectly fine.
Yeah, that's right. The supplies that they have on board are really there in case we had a wave-off scenario. So if we were to have some kind of weather come in or something happen to the spacecraft where ground teams would want more time to troubleshoot and understand and see if they could recover fault tolerance on the vehicle, that would give them time to do a couple more orbits and then try again at another opportunity. Right now, vehicle looking very healthy. It's been very healthy the entire time it's been attached to station. Actually, the entire period while we were attached to space station, we were doing weekly checkouts on the vehicle of the life support system, thermal system, power system, and the prop system on board. And spacecraft has been pretty solid the entire mission.
So while we are in this holding period right now of depressurization, we're holding at that 5 psi, 5 pounds per square inch to make sure that there is no difference in temperature that's really causing that to fluctuate. A look ahead at the undocking, we are expecting to see undocking last about 5.5 minutes. And during that time, undocking for Dragon looks a little bit different than for other vehicles. When the Soyuz is on the International Space Station, it undocks by using springs that push it away from the space station, and Dragon will instead use a couple of undock burns. So 2 small, short burns, about 1.5 seconds for one of them and 5 for the other, and those will just do just enough to bring Dragon away from the International Space Station so that it can conduct its departure burns later.
Yeah, Dragon actually has 16 Draco thrusters on the base of the spacecraft, 12 in what we call the service section of the spacecraft, and 4 that would be underneath the nose cone around that forward hatch. The nose cone Dracos, the forward bulkhead Dracos, as we like to call them, are actually disabled for this portion of the mission and will be disabled for the next 3 expected burns, which would be that undock 1 burn, undock 2 burn, and then what we refer to as departure 0, which gets us on a path out of the approach ellipsoid and the keep-out sphere around the International Space Station. So these first 3 burns will actually only use the 12 service section Dracos. And we actually have that many because of redundancy on the vehicle. So we could lose certain combinations of those thrusters and still have full dimensionality control and the ability to control the vehicle's position, apply thrust to it.
So if you're wondering what's keeping Dragon attached to the International Space Station right now, there are 2 sets of hooks, 6 on each side, so 12 hooks. And when that undocking sequence begins, the hooks will open and the umbilical, which provides power from the space station to Crew Dragon, that will detach, and then those short burns will fire and Crew Dragon will be on its way.
Yeah, those 12 hooks, hard capture hooks, are actually what also provides the seal as well. So they ensure that the vestibule has that leak-tight seal. And on the way up, when we docked in late May, that was one of the major milestones after we had attached, verifying that the soft capture system had completely closed and that all those hooks had driven closed.
So as you can see, NASA astronaut and commander of the International Space Station, Chris Cassidy, he's staying behind on the International Space Station for right now, and he'll return to Earth aboard a Soyuz in October. But he has just closed the Node 2 hatch. So the APAS hatch was closed earlier by Cassidy. The Dragon hatch was closed, and now just even creating a more firm seal by closing that Node 2 hatch. And as you mentioned earlier, that's on the front end of the space station, if it really had a front side. So so that's where they're at. And you saw him taking some pictures, recording that process, and he'll be able to deliver those to the ground later for analysis and just to check out at how everything went, this first departure for Crew Dragon with a crew.
Good view from the interior of Dragon. We're looking at the pilot's side seat. So that's Bob Behnken, and you can see Doug Hurley's hands on just behind him.
Hey, Chris, that call came down on SpaceX Dragón-1, so I'm just going to read back on the big loop that we confirm.
And if you actually look on the right-hand...
Node 2 forward hatch and the MPEV are closed. And Chris, I owe you shortly what the undock sequence time is.
And that was a call to Chris Cassidy on the space station, checking out and making sure that they were just echoing that they saw that Node 2 forward hatch closure. Things progressing well for an on-time departure. When Doug and Bob got into the spacecraft today, they had a few housekeeping things to do. They wanted to make sure those footrests that you see right there are firmly attached for the ride home. And then you can see a window over to the right of your screen. Those have had some window covers on them. They removed both of those, but they are still available so that when the crew go to sleep later tonight, they'll be able to put those window covers back up. That'll keep them from seeing a sunrise every 45 minutes or a sunset, because the space station, as we mentioned, is orbiting Earth at 17,500 miles an hour. And so they see quite a few beautiful views, sunrises and sunsets every day, 16 to be exact.
Yeah, and you can actually kind of get a sense for how bright that might be. Spacecraft and the International Space Station are currently not in the Earth's shadow, so in sunlight, and you can see how bright the window can get, almost rivaling the lights in the cabin. Now that window is actually right next to the side hatch, so you can see there's a black strip next to that window. That's actually a handrest, a handhold, and next to that is the side hatch. And that's actually what Bob and Doug will be egressing out of after they do, after successful reentry, parachute deployment, and splashdown.
Yeah, so that's what we saw the crew climb in. Once they crossed that crew access arm, that last place that they were on Earth in that white room, they climbed in through that side hatch, but that's not what's attached to the International Space Station. The nose cone on Crew Dragon opens up and, as you said, exposes those thrusters underneath, and they actually floated through that hatch. So they arrived through that one and departed through that one, but once they get back on Earth, that side hatch is the primary egress or exit from the vehicle for Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley.
Yeah, and actually one of the steps right when Bob and Doug had entered the vehicle on the launch pad was to do a leak check of that hatch. Hatch remains sealed the entire time while we're in space, and really only gets opened once we're back safely on Earth.
So pretty noteworthy about this mission, that there are a lot of firsts for this mission. It's our return to flight from American soil for the first time in 9 years, since the space shuttle program. And it's also going to be the first splashdown in over 45 years. So actually on July 24th, just a couple of weeks ago, that was the 45-year anniversary of the last Apollo capsule splashdown with the Apollo-Soyuz test project. So it's been a long time since we've seen a crew splash down. That typically happens with a landing. Of course, the shuttle was an orbiter and could land like a plane. And then the Soyuz, which astronauts have been arriving in for the past 9 years, that lands on land in the steppes of Kazakhstan. So this one we're looking to land in the Gulf Coast. It means a much quicker ride home for Bob and Doug once they get back.
Yeah, once we get through the Earth's atmosphere, we'll have 2 drogue chutes deploy and then 4 main chutes deploy, and then splashdown currently targeted for Pensacola, so off the west coast of Florida. And recovery actually looks a little bit different than it did 45 years ago. So we have some pretty cool recovery boats, have helicopter pads on them, as well as a what we refer to as it's as an A-arm, but it's basically a crane on the back of the spacecraft. So, excuse me, on the back of the boat. And a couple of fast boat teams will go out to the capsule, verify that it's safe to approach. Then that boat will come up, scoop up the Dragon spacecraft, put it on the deck. They'll secure everything and then open up the hatches and help Bob and Doug egress on the recovery ship.
If you've ever seen any of that old Apollo footage, the astronauts actually used to get out in the water. And so a little bit different this time. The crew will be waiting until that boat arrives with that crane to lift them up onto the deck, and they'll get the chance to get out on the boat instead of on the seas.
Yeah, and actually for recovery, we have 7 potential recovery sites, what we refer to as supported landing sites. So those are areas where a recovery team can get there very quickly, recover the crew within a couple of hours of their splashdown, but usually actually much faster than that. So we've got 4 sites in the Gulf Coast on the west, or in the Gulf on the west coast of Florida, and then 3 sites on the east coast of Florida. One of them, of course, being Cape Canaveral.
So as we were watching this past week, this tropical storm become a hurricane, there was some concern about returning today because we do have some recovery criteria. Landing in the water is a lot more difficult than landing on land because you have to consider things like wave height and wind speed. And so we are looking at those spaces in the Gulf, and they're looking pretty good compared to obviously the spaces on the east side of Florida. But yes, we have to take into consideration what the helicopters can arrive in and what all the boats can withstand and what the crew capsule itself can withstand.
Yeah, that's right. The hurricane Isaias moving up, I think, the east coast of Florida now. So hopefully folks are staying safe out there. I know Doug actually took some photos from the cupola of this hurricane as it's moving up the east coast. But luckily, no major impact to weather on the west coast. Good winds, no significant lightning, no significant rain is projected for the area. And I think importantly as well, the wave heights, which are important for the spacecraft, but also for the recovery ship to be able to get close and for teams to secure the spacecraft and ensure that it's safe for recovery.
So currently we are in a hold period of the vestibule depressurization. That's the area between the hatches that the astronauts fly through or float through when they arrive and float through when they depart. So we are holding at 5 pounds per square inch for 25 minutes to make sure that checks out, and they continue with depressurization after that. But Bob and Doug, as you can see, this view over their shoulder, it makes it look like we're on the ride with them. They have donned their suits. They are in their seats, monitoring everything on those screens aboard Crew Dragon.
Why don't we actually check in with Gary at Johnson Space Center in Houston, hear how things are going on the space station side, and how do things look, Johnson, Gary?
Shiva, things are looking great here. We are also watching that vestibule depressurization, of course, complete now, holding at 5 psi. We're just looking at that thermal stabilization, just waiting for it to stabilize, balance out its swings, so we can get a nice solid leak check before continuing down close to vac. Successfully close and lock the Node 2 forward hatch, completing his duties for the day. So he will be, of course, watching Bob and Doug depart the station. He'll be in the cupola module. This is that 7-bay window that looks right down on the Earth, provides a very good view of the Dragon departing from the forward end of the International Space Station. He'll have a camera right in his hand and be able to take some pictures as they depart the International Space Station. But the primary monitoring role will actually be in the hands of Bob and Doug, the Dragon vehicle being an autonomous departure vehicle, Bob and Doug being able to take control if necessary with the monitoring role, and then the backup monitoring role here in Mission Control Houston. So as soon as we continue this depressurization of the vestibule close to vacuum, just about 4:20 p.m. Pacific time, we're looking to conduct a go, no-go. That's, I think, a little bit less than an hour from now at this time that we'll conduct a go, no-go to start the undocking sequence. So the undocking sequence will be detaching the umbilical and then releasing a 12.
Today, Bob and Doug had actually loaded some powered cargo into the vehicle, and the life support system is reactivated. And then after sealing the hatches on both the International Space Station side and stepping into the spacecraft, we did some leak checks on the suits to step into vestibule leak checks now.
Yeah, and so that vestibule area, we're holding at 5 psi, 5 pounds per square inch to conduct and make sure that it is holding and not fluctuating due to any temperature changes. Actually, the crew on the International Space Station, as I mentioned earlier, this is evening for them. And so it's actually 10:30 almost aboard the International Space Station, 10:30 p.m. And so they'll be getting ready to go to sleep soon. The crew here in Crew Dragon got to take a a 3-hour nap today in the middle of the day. Looks like actually the whole crew was able to enjoy that nap. That way they'd all be alert and ready to conduct these departure procedures, whether it be sealing up the hatches or conducting any of the leak checks, monitoring the ride home. We want to make sure the astronauts are well rested, and even though the crew on the International Space Station will get their sleep period soon, we'll see Bob and Doug get theirs. They'll have about 8 hours later tonight to get some shut-eye.
Yeah, that'll actually sleep shift them well before they start to step into the deorbit burn, which is actually the largest burn of the day and actually a pretty dynamic period time for them. So I want to make sure that they are all well rested so they can monitor and step in if they have to take any contingency actions, and also read back on the status of the vehicle if ground control teams are unable to properly assess the health of the system. Of course, one of the nice things about having crew members aboard is they can see the health of the vehicle and they can respond. Bob and Doug able to issue commands via those touchscreen displays, and also getting quite a bit of training on potential emergency scenarios, wave-offs, scenarios where they might need to interact with Dragon, and if it were to lose comms or have a thruster issue. But right now, very healthy vehicle. Haven't really seen any issues with Dragon during its 63-day stay at the International Space Station.
And if you were wondering, once Dragon departs today from the International Space Station, we're not going anywhere. We're actually going to be live all the way until they come home to Earth tomorrow. So some of the bigger things we can look forward to after undocking, we've got a couple of departure burns. The first two are going to bring Dragon up and over the International Space Station, and then the next two will bring it down and in front of the space station before a phasing burn later this afternoon to help it really sync up with its landing zone for tomorrow.
That's right. I think I might have heard a call.
Heard a little something.
Okay, there might be a call coming on Space to Ground. We'll be sure to keep an eye out for that.
Looks like pressure in the vestibule is still holding.
Yeah, and so as part of those burns that they have to do, the first couple of burns are really just to adjust the apogee and the perigee. So the apogee, if you can imagine the orbit of a spacecraft as an ellipse going around the Earth, the apogee is the highest point, or the point farthest away from the planet, and the perigee is the lowest point. And so right now, Dragon and the International Space Station, of course, still docked, and they're in a roughly circular orbit. After the conclusion of these departure burns, Dragon's apogee will be about 10 kilometers below the International Space Station, but we'll be slowly reducing our perigee. And then later on tonight, Pacific time, we'll actually conduct what's called a phasing burn. And the goal there is to adjust the orientation of that orbit just so we get our orbital pathway to line up over the landing site, where we will, or line up with a path that will cross over the landing site, where we can, when we issue our departure burn sequence, we'll be able to line up landing off the coast of Florida near Pensacola.
As you can see, Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley in their suits now, but after those first couple of departure burns, they'll actually be able to take off their suits, and they won't need to put them back on or don them again until tomorrow, just before the deorbit burn. And then they'll wear them the entire rest of their ride home. But for the majority of the rest of the evening after the departure burns 1 and 2, they'll be able to take off those spacesuits, relax a little bit more, enjoy their ride in Crew Dragon. And while Crew Dragon was on the International Space Station, we actually conducted some habitability tests. Of course, there's 2 astronauts flying today, but our future crews are scheduled to have 4 astronauts. So we brought in a couple of the space station's current residents to test out what it's like to have multiple people in Dragon once it's in microgravity. Performed lots of tests inside the vehicle. They had a little sleep period to see how it would be to sleep with 4 people in the vehicle, and things went pretty well. Looking forward to that first Crew 1 launch later this year.
Yeah, so right now, Dragon and the International Space Station about 422 kilometers above the Earth's surface. And going about 7.6 kilometers per second, which should be close to that 17,500 number that you probably hear pretty often.
Yes, and if you're looking at miles, it looks like we're about 261 statute miles above the Earth. And they are in the South Pacific Ocean. They'll be coming up across Hawaii not too long from now.
There's a view from the International Space Station looking at the Dragon spacecraft. So Bob and Doug inside the portion towards the right of your screen. If you can imagine how they're seating upright, their displays would sort of be looking up towards the direction the nose cone is opened up. And behind them is the trunk of the spacecraft. So that top side, the black shiny part, is actually our solar panels on the body of the spacecraft. And below that, the white side of the spacecraft is the radiator. So that's where we're radiating away our heat generated by the avionics and the electronic hardware aboard the vehicle, and of course from Bob and Doug themselves. Generating a little bit of heat based on how much physical activity and exertion they're doing. Right now it looks like they're pretty comfortable, just kind of hanging out in their suits.
And actually, the vestibule leak check has started, and so they're testing to ensure the solidarity of those seals between the hatches. And as we saw earlier, they checked to make sure there was no foreign object debris FOD, so that they would have a clean seal and be able to complete this leak check successfully. Another step toward undocking.
These leak checks should be pretty fast. They'll be looking to see if there's any pressure rise on the vestibule itself, which would indicate pressure coming through the forward hatch seal.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop. Vestibule thermal stabilization is complete and the leak check period has started. Additionally, the Dragon to Ground path is now available. If you would like to swap one of your audio destinations to Dragon to Ground, I am happy to support a comm check at this time.
Okay, Bob will do that.
SpaceX Dragon comm checks Dragon to Ground.
I hear you loud and clear. How me?
And Anna, you're came in very quiet. I'll bump up that channel and maybe we could try it again.
Copy. How is this?
That's a little bit better, Anna, but got it cranked up to be able to hear you just for your awareness. A little bit different volume between the big loop and hearing you on the big loop and hearing you on Dragon to Ground.
Copy. I will make sure to talk loudly into the Dragon to Ground path.
And Dragon, Houston on Dragon to Ground for a comm check. How do you copy me?
And Houston, we have you loud and clear on Dragon to Ground.
Actually, my bad. I was not on the correct loop. Comm check again on Dragon to Ground from Houston.
Okay, Leslie, we have you loud and clear on Dragon to Ground. Much clearer, much less echo on this loop than the big loop.
That's a good data point, and we also have you loud and clear down here.
So we just heard some comm checks between the crew aboard the Crew Dragon and the core here on the ground, and then with the Capcom in Houston. They're two very similar positions. We call ours the Capcom because it stands for Capsule Communicator, and we are in a capsule once again. For a few years there, obviously we were flying a space shuttle, so not quite a capsule, but before that we had Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, all capsules, and this person was once used to be typically an astronaut so that they could communicate any specific details about the vehicle, especially based on their previous experience. Now we have Capcoms who are not necessarily astronauts, but obviously very, very well studied in the vehicle.
Yeah, the way we refer to them is the crew's advocate on the ground. They're trying to think of things ahead of their crew and have information that the crew might need where but they tend to act as the advocate for the crew on the ground, letting them know where equipment might be stored in the vehicle, letting them know of upcoming steps. If there's any troubleshooting that the crew need to do or information that the crew need, they interact with the crew. Typically also train very closely with crew in simulations and also during their training periods to get them familiar with all of the procedures that they need to operate in the spacecraft. Now, during those comm checks, there was some discussion about the big loop and Dragon to ground and space to ground, a lot of different loops. Really what a loop just refers to is a communications link. Operators all have the ability to talk on these loops and provide real-time communication. Usually they are redundant loops, so if you had a problem with one of the comm systems, then there's a redundant backup so you can ensure you have good voice communication with the crew. And once we get away from space station outside of the keep-out sphere and the approach ellipsoid, we'll actually transition to what's referred to as Dragon to ground. So we'll be issuing a lot of that communication via Dragon's transmitters through those TDRS satellites back to ground.
So I mentioned earlier, 63 days aboard the International Space Station for these two spacefarers. Was not their first flight. They'd both had 2 previous shuttle missions, and they both have families that are very excited to see them once they get home. I know some folks here around at SpaceX refer to them as the space dads. Both have young boys, and I know that they have to be excited to get back to their families soon.
And the space dads actually brought a cool zero-G indicator up with them. An apatosaurus, a kind of sparkly apatosaurus, who was sitting in the seat next to them for the ride up. And as I understand, their sons actually voted that that was going to be the zero-G indicator between the two of them.
They're also bringing something really interesting and with a lot of history to it back to the ground. There was an American flag aboard the International Space Station that flew on the first space shuttle mission and the final space shuttle mission, and it was left aboard the space station. That way it could be retrieved by the next crew who launched from America, and so they are also bringing home that piece of history as well.
Yeah, so I was looking up some facts earlier. The first space shuttle mission in April 1981. So that flag has been to space quite a while, and it's been on station now for about 9 years, which is a pretty long time to be in space.
Yeah, it's probably traveled more miles than any human ever, or any astronaut ever, for sure.
So if you're just joining us, we're currently looking at 2 views inside the Dragon spacecraft. Right now in the seats are spacecraft commander Doug Hurley on the left-hand side, or in the left-hand seat, and Bob Benkin, the Joint Operations Commander, in the right-hand seat. The crew got on board, had a relatively busy day packing cargo on board the spacecraft. They closed the forward hatch and the APAS hatch on the pressurized mating adapter on the International Space Station side. And they're currently in the middle of a vestibule leak check. So the vestibule, the space in between the 2 spacecraft, the 2 spacecraft being the International Space Station and Dragon. So we've brought that down to about 5 psi at this point, and verifying that there's no leakage from either side.
The International Space Station is also in the current proper configuration for that departure. They do something called feathering the solar arrays, and so what they do is they turn and lock them at an angle. That way, when Dragon leaves the space station, obviously it's going to use its thrusters, and those thrusters have exhaust that are emitted, and we don't want those to contaminate any of the solar cells on the arrays because that makes them less functional. They can't perform as well if they're coated in exhaust, and so those exhaust plumes avoid the solar arrays because they are feathered, and we also just don't want to put extra stress on the solar arrays. So it sounds like the International Space Station and is set up well for the upcoming departure of Crew Dragon.
And as kind of a preview of what's happening on the ground side, so operators and mission control in Houston, and of course operators here in mission control on Hawthorne, looking at health of the vehicle systems. Right now we are in what are called joint operations because of our proximity to the International Space Station. And so in joint operations, the flight director out of Houston is actually the prime authority for any commanding or anything that'll occur up in space close to the International Space Station. So both teams are conducting health checks against a set of what we refer to as flight rules to check on the health of the vehicle, configuration of the vehicle, and then verifying that their procedures are go for undocking. All those checks happening concurrently with this leak check.
Yeah, we'll be in those joint operations through the exit of the approach ellipsoid. So there are two invisible lines, sort of, that vehicles cross upon arrival and departure from the International Space Station, and these help us govern, we have specific rules for each one that the vehicle shouldn't cross if they violate any of those. And so some of those, for the keep-out sphere, that smaller sphere around the space station, we call that 4 orbits safe. So if the Dragon were for some reason lose control of any of its thrusters, it would be safe for 4 orbits if like not hitting the International Space Station if it's inside that keep-out sphere. And then the approach ellipsoid has a little bit of a lesser time frame. You need to be 24 hours safe. And that gives time for the teams on the ground to troubleshoot anything that might arise, as we mentioned, if there were some reason they couldn't send commands to the vehicle or the vehicle couldn't be commanded by the astronauts. So those are typically hold points on the way up for our visiting vehicles, but on the way home, we won't be stopping any. We'll be heading straight for Earth with a splashdown planned for tomorrow.
Here's an external view of the Dragon spacecraft from the International Space Station. That structure that you see, kind of hemispherical structure on the top, is actually the nose cone. And then on the right-hand side of your screen is that pressurized mating adapter that we saw the crew in earlier. So Commander Chris Cassidy aboard the space station, closing the APAS hatch and Node 2 forward hatch on those two. And of course, Bob and Doug closing the Dragon forward hatch. And much later on in the mission, right before we are planning to step into, right before we really re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, we'll end up closing that nose cone to protect the sensors and thrusters that live underneath it.
Another thing we'll also see happen is the jettison of the trunk. And so the trunk was on the end of Crew Dragon. You could see it had the solar cells wrapped around it, helping Dragon gather power from the sun. And that'll be removed. There you can see it again. It's got some fins on it back there. That will not return to Earth with the Crew Dragon capsule. That will actually burn up upon reentry into the Earth's atmosphere. And that's where, on the way up, we would be able to store any unpressurized cargo. So if there were something that we'd like to install on the outside of the International Space Station, that would be a good place to put it, and the astronauts could use that. It's an extra trunk. I mean, it's exactly what it is. So it's not for any of their personal luggage, but it's great for any of that unpressurized cargo.
Yeah, those aerodynamic fins are actually pretty important. If there were a launch escape event, those aerodynamic fins provide stability to the vehicle as it were to separate from Falcon 9. Of course, we didn't need to see that during this mission, and hopefully we won't see that ever since the in-flight abort mission that happened. And the back on the trunk also contains the thermal coolant loops for the vehicle, so we radiate away heat to space. Of course, on planet Earth, you can sort of just push a breeze by you to get some nice cooling, but in space, you have to radiate away all that heat because there's it's a vacuum around you, so you can't take advantage of convective heat transfer away from the spacecraft. Although, interesting tidbit, there is just enough of an atmosphere to be a drag, and actually the International Space Station needs to do periodic reboosts to stay in its orbit, right?
And they did one of those very recently. That was factored into Dragon's departure procedures as the International Space Station used its thrusters to reboost it, and in preparation for this October when it will have Soyuz vehicle arrive with some brand new crew members. And so this was factored into Dragon's departure sequence, knowing at which altitude the International Space Station would be flying. And it looks right now the International Space Station is flying 262 statute miles over the North Pacific Ocean. It looks like they will be crossing into North America soon, and specifically coming up over the coast of Oregon.
A kind of a preview of what's coming up next. Currently conducting a leak check of the vestibule. Now, particularly important because any breathable gas that you bring with you into space is what you bring on your spaceship. So the International Space Station with a supply of breathable gases, and of course Dragon with tanks aboard that contain nitrogen and oxygen, and the life support system providing periodic injections of oxygen to keep the cabin at about 20 to 25% oxygen, which is about what we would have actually here on Earth. So doing a leak check, making sure that we're not losing any of that precious breathable gas through the forward hatch seal, which has been open really this entire time while we've been on space station.
We've seen a few milestones happen so far today. Of course, we've got a lot to look forward to, but we saw the Dragon hatch close earlier after Bob and Doug were safely inside. Shortly thereafter, Chris Cassidy closed the space station side. That's the A-Pass hatch, and then eventually the Node 2 hatch. That allowed us to step into this vestibule depressurization period, bringing that space in between those hatches down to as close to a vacuum as we can possibly bring it before departure later. So yes, now conducting those leak checks, and then we will be looking for a go, no-go for undock coming up at 4:20 Pacific.
So during that go, no-go for undocking, ground operators will be looking at the health of vehicle systems, verifying that everything seems pressure and leak tight, verifying the configurations of both the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station. And then we'll actually expect to hear a call up to the crew, see if they're ready to come on home. And then ground operators here in Hawthorne will issue a command to the Dragon spacecraft that will begin the process of detaching the umbilicals that are providing power and telemetry from the space station to the Dragon spacecraft, and then actually removing the 12 hard capture hooks that are keeping the vestibule leak tight right now. And Dragon will do a couple of undocking burns as well, short little thrusts.
Yes, two.
From the surface section.
Very short. Will actually specifically be 1.5 seconds and then another for 5 seconds. So I think Gary described them earlier as pulses. I think that's a great way to describe them rather than necessarily as long as a burn. But even our departure burns later are short to start off with. Departure burn 0 looking to be about 12 seconds long, and then departure burn 1 for 20 seconds. And those increase the opening rate between the spacecraft and the International Space Station. And after that departure burn 1, they can take off their suits, get comfortable, and relax until time for that deorbit burn tomorrow.
Yeah, the deorbit burn is a pretty big burn, and the departure phasing burn is actually a very large burn. Departure phasing should last about 6 minutes or so, and the deorbit burn will actually be on the order of 9 to 10 minutes. definitely the largest thrusts of at least the return portion of the mission. And for the facing burn, that's really to line us up with our potential landing site over Pensacola in the Gulf of Mexico. And the deorbit burn will reduce our perigee, or the lowest point of Dragon's orbit, so that we end up getting caught by the Earth's atmosphere. Dragon will actually then get a chance to use its heat shield and slow down against the Earth's atmosphere. And then once we get to the right sort of pressure characteristics and altitude characteristics as sensed by the vehicle, then we'll have the drogue chutes deploy, slow us down even further before finally seeing those 4 main chutes deploy. That'll bring Dragon down to a nice gentle landing in the ocean.
And I learned something really interesting about parachutes. So whenever you see those drogue chutes deploy, they don't automatically inflate right away. That's because they're doing something called reefing, and that keeps the air from flowing into the parachute too quickly and shocking the parachute system on Crew Dragon. So they expand very slowly and begin to slow the vehicle down rather than all at once and giving a jolt to the spacecraft.
Yeah, and actually even with the drogue chutes and the main chutes opening slowly, Bob and Doug will still experience somewhere between 4 and 5 Gs of acceleration. So, 1 G is what we experience sort of just standing here. If you can imagine yourself being 4 times or 5 times as heavy just for that brief period of time, that's about how much force they'll experience. Of course, both of them test pilots. Test pilots usually train up to, depending on if you're in the Navy or the Air Force, 7 to 9 Gs. So nothing that they're probably unfamiliar with.
So you've got this really good close-up view of Crew Dragon attached to the International Space Station. That's the Node 2 forward hatch. You can see the nose cone is open. That will be closed later after the departure burn and prior to re-entry, but that is how the astronauts ingressed or entered the International Space Station when they arrived 63 days ago, and how they exited the space station when they prepare to depart today. So this is a great view, and that's where we will begin to see some movement once that undocking command is sent later this afternoon. So some more facts about our astronauts today. We mentioned that they have had 2 previous flights on the space shuttle, and this is their first flight not on a space shuttle, and so both just logged 63 days aboard the space station. It'll be 64 by the time they return home. So Doug Hurley will have a total of 93 days in space over his 3 space flights, 2 on the shuttles, including that last shuttle mission. And then Bob Behnken will have logged a total of 92 days in space over his 3 flights. So very close there. But adding up some time aboard the International Space Station.
And Bob Behnken actually getting some pretty cool opportunities to conduct a number of spacewalks with Chris Cassidy, going outside the space station, conducting some work to replace power units and batteries on the space station?
Yes, they actually replaced some older nickel hydrogen batteries with some newer lithium ion batteries, and these upgrades have been going on for a few years now. And the astronauts were very efficient. They conducted 4 spacewalks, Chris Cassidy and Bob Behnken. And in the meantime, Doug Hurley was inside, and he was controlling the Canadarm2. That's the robotic arm on the International Space Station. And so all 3 with a very important role in those spacewalks. And it became quite a milestone for Behnken and Cassidy. They both now have conducted 10 spacewalks in their career, and that ties them with the most spacewalks by an American astronaut. They're now tied with 10 with Mike Lopez Alegria and Peggy Whitson.
Dragon SpaceX, we had a good vestibule leak check.
I can copy. It's good news. Thank you.
There's confirmation from the core of successful leak check on the vestibule. That means 1 more milestone down and getting ready for undock.
Yeah, and that wraps up the completion of those leak checks, as you mentioned, in that small space between Crew Dragon and the space station, the vestibule. It was brought down from a pressure of, it looked like 14.1 pounds per square inch, and then to 5. So they had that hold period and then conducted leak checks. But that 14.1 was the same as the rest of the station. Now they are offset quite a bit, and so they're going to bring that all the way down to vacuum, since that's what they will be exposed to, the hatches, I mean, once Crew Dragon Endeavour begins its journey home.
Yeah, and actually, if we didn't bring that space down to vacuum, then it would almost act like a thruster. There'd be a little bit of pressure left up in there, and so as the seals came, or as the seals were sort of opened up and we removed those hard capture hooks, we'd see a little propulsive thrust. And of course, being this close to station, we want every maneuver to be very carefully choreographed, so trying to make sure there's as little energy imparted by that little bit of pressure in the mating adapter. So actually, now would be a great time to hear what's going on at Mission Control Houston, get an update on the space station. Gary, can you let us know how it's going?
Hey, Shiva, we're watching the depressurization of the vestibule now. It's a little bit less than 4.5 psi, a little bit slower than what we saw just a little bit an hour ago when we went from about the pressure of sea level down to 5 psi, really only taking a few minutes. This one's a little bit slower, but we are seeing a good depressurization of the vestibule, those all being controlled from the Dragon side, and we're monitoring here from Mission Control Houston. Now, some of the views you might see from the outside of the International Space Station looking at the Dragon vehicle, some of those cameras being controlled from Mission Control in Japan. Working from here in Mission Control Houston with the Japanese Mission Control Room to make sure we're going to get good views with those cameras. We're going to get a little pan as the Dragon makes its way away from the International Space Station, and that first departure burn 0, brings it a little bit faster away from the station. We'll get a nice view from the Japanese side of the International Space Station. Right now, the International Space Station configured for undocking. We do have those solar arrays feathered. That's in a locked position.
Station Houston on the Big Loop. Endeavour's undock sequence start time is planned for 23:30 GMT. That is 28 minutes from now.
You heard that from Capcom here in Mission Control Houston. That is Leslie Ringo here in Mission Control Houston. That start time is 4:30 p.m. Pacific, 6:30 p.m. Central. That is the on-time start time for the undocking sequence. Once that kicks off, that'll be the initiation of the umbilical retraction, followed by 12 hooks that are keeping Dragon in place attached to the International Space Station. Those will drive and be released 6 at a time. They're in 2 gangs. And then, of course, there's 2 undocking burns, more like pulses, just short little burps, that are going to physically separate Dragon from the International Space Station vehicle. You can hear right now everything going according to plan. We're right on the timeline. That physical separation, as long as we're on the timeline, should happen at 4:34 and 58 seconds p.m. Pacific time. Everything going well. We'll continue to monitor the depressurization of the vestibule from here in Mission Control Houston. Until then, we'll send it back over to you in Hawthorne.
Thanks, Gary. So once Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley arrived at the space station on May 31st, it did not take them long to get to work. During the time on board the orbiting laboratory, as we mentioned, Bob Behnken ventured outside the hatch 4 times for spacewalks to upgrade those batteries, and Doug Hurley used the Canadarm2 to command the station's robotic arm from the inside of the station. But when they weren't focusing on the outside of the station, they continued science and research inside the orbiting laboratory. Of course, as we mentioned, they also exercised the mandatory 2 hours each day. And many of you have seen some of the incredible pictures that they took of our home planet. This is one beautiful view of a sun glint off the ocean. And then there's also one that we have from Comet Neowise in July. If you had the opportunity to see that from the ground, we saw our astronauts had a great shot of that from the International Space Station.
Yeah, they had some really cool opportunities. We're sharing a lot of those photos on Twitter. And of course, you know, earlier this morning as they've been preparing for undocking, they had some work to do as well in packing cargo into the Dragon spacecraft. So underneath their seats, they've got room for powered and unpowered cargo. Right now, they're bringing home about 150 kilograms, or about 330 pounds of cargo. Most of that is science and sampling hardware. About 94 kilograms, or about 200 pounds of it, is science that's happening aboard the space station. And Dragon does have the ability to return a lot of that cargo, so it can come back to labs here on Earth who can continue to do human science studies on those biological samples and cold sample studies on those cold samples that they're returning. And it's really something that we've been doing even since our previous version of Cargo Dragon, just doing that capability with Crew Dragon.
Yeah, that's one thing I was going to mention. When the astronauts know that there is a Crew Dragon or a Cargo Dragon vehicle coming, they know it's about to get really busy with a lot of science. Because Cargo Dragon is currently the only vehicle cargo resupply ship we have that can bring back cargo. The others disintegrate, burn up in the Earth's atmosphere upon re-entry. So we mentioned earlier that Comet Neowise picture, and I think we have it now. Look at how beautiful that is. The comet streaking across the sky just above the Earth below. I can't imagine.
Yeah, especially to see the glow of the Earth's atmosphere kind of creating that blue sheen as the light refracts off of it. Really cool.
And this was probably taken from the cupola window, and that's, as Gary mentioned, that bay window area on the International Space Station that faces down toward Earth. It's truly the best view in the house. Chris Cassidy might head over there after undocking today to take a look outside and watch as his friends depart. We saw that on the way uphill, he was in there monitoring their arrival and taking some pictures of Crew Dragon as it arrived as well. But aside from all of that science talk, we'll also be returning some vehicle hardware like spacewalking cooling garments, which the astronauts wear under their extravehicular mobility unit suits. There's tubes of water that they can control the temperature of. So when they are in the sun outside of the space station, it can be up to 250 degrees Fahrenheit.
Wow.
And when they are in the darkness and outside the space station, it can be negative 250 degrees Fahrenheit. So that cooling garment is also, in a way, a little bit of a heating garment and can help them control their temperature when they're outside on a spacewalk. So we'll be returning some of those. Also some glove connectors for refurbishment back on Earth, and along with any crew provisions like food, small electronics, and even their sleeping bags. NASA will have cargo specialists embedded with the recovery team. They'll be able to quickly recover and unload that returned cargo very shortly after Dragon returns on the recovery ship to shore tomorrow.
Yeah, and it was really interesting. You're mentioning the wide temperature variations. That's something you don't really see on Earth because we have air and have humidity in the air that helps us sort of regulate that temperature. Of course, you don't have all that humidity and atmosphere around you to help with that. So when you're in the sun, you're getting the full brunt of that heat, and when you're not, you're getting the full coolness of being in eclipse. And so that's part of the reason why you need those extra vehicular suits, as well as like the thermal systems on Dragon, to help regulate that temperature into something that is palatable for humans.
And speaking of heat and atmosphere, when the astronauts re-enter tomorrow, they will be traveling, or they will experience temperatures up to 3,500 degrees outside the crew vehicle. Inside it'll be nice and cool. They've got some air conditioning, and their suits will have cooled air venting through them. So that's a pretty fiery re-entry tomorrow.
Another view on your screen of the Dragon spacecraft, and now looking at a camera that's positioned just behind Bob and Doug. So Doug in the left-hand seat, Bob in the right-hand seat, monitoring the vehicle. Looks like they've got the forward view, so on each of their individual panels. You can sort of tell that because it looks like they've got an attitude ring in front of them. And then they've got a view in the middle that has their procedures and cue cards up for what they can expect next. And speaking of which, actually, so the next thing we'll really see here is final configuration for undocking. So there'll be a go, no-go poll for issuing that final configuration. We're expecting that to happen, the actual command to occur right on time at 4:30 p.m. Pacific time. And then shortly after that, we'll have a couple of those undocking bursts that will just separate any sort of friction, any sort of forces that may have statically built up while Dragon's been hanging out on station. And separation is planned for 4:34 p.m. Pacific time, 4:34 and 58 seconds, actually.
Yes, so from the time that command is sent from ground to start undocking, as you mentioned, those hooks have to be retracted, those 12 hooks, 2 sets of 6. The umbilical that has been providing power to Dragon from the International Space Station will detach, and they will use those 2 short bursts to begin their journey home.
Yeah, and a lot of those steps are automated. Once we issue the command for undocking configuration, operators here in Mission Control will be monitoring that Dragon performs the correct state transitions. Dragon has flight computers aboard that they're triplicated for redundancy, so if one of the flight computers gets out of sync with the others, you still have the other 2 to make a good call. And of course, we have ways of resetting them and trying to understand those faults. That's part of the job of the mission controllers, to make sure they understand the health and status of the vehicle. So those flight computers will transition the vehicle through a number of states and then activate those thrusters. We'll have a couple of short bursts from the service section Draco thrusters. So those are the thrusters on the lower part of the vehicle, just above the heat shield and the trunk. And we won't be using the forward bulkhead Draco thrusters that are underneath the nose cone. So we'll see those 2 bursts that'll help take Dragon up and above, away from the International Station into a slightly higher orbit, letting Space Station move ahead.
Yes, those will be departure burns 0 and 1. Then that'll just increase the opening rate, the distance from the space station, and moving it out of the keep out sphere, as we mentioned earlier, and eventually the approach ellipsoid. And then after it's out of the approach ellipsoid, it'll have departure burns 2 and 3. Departure burn 3, as you mentioned earlier, is like a co-elliptic burn. So it puts it on the same orbit all the way around, rather than necessarily having a widely varying apogee and perigee, or higher point of the orbit and lowest point of the orbit.
Yeah, and we were talking a little bit about the keep out sphere and the approach ellipsoid. So those are imaginary spheres. The keep out sphere being a 200-meter radius, I believe, sphere around the International Space Station. So that represents a space where any spacecraft that are in those operations need very choreographed maneuvers with the flight director before they issue any commands or perform any thrusts.
Station and Dragon crew on the big loop. I want to let you know that at this time we are removing ISS power to Endeavour.
Okay.
So a call there from the Capcom saying that both the station crew and, of course, Bob and Doug no longer receiving power from the International Space Station through those umbilicals on the docking mechanism.
Yeah, so Dragon is operating on its own power, generated and gathered by those solar panels wrapped around the trunk of the vehicle. And that's actually a very similar look to the new cargo Dragon. For all of the Dragon missions until now, we saw solar wings with solar arrays, and now the cargo Dragon missions will have the solar arrays wrapped around the vehicle, just like we see here with Crew Dragon.
Yeah, and actually it's something that adds to the overall reliability of the vehicle. Anytime you have a mechanism in space that's potential for something to go wrong, you need a motor to drive it. You need checkouts potentially on the actuators. There's probably software that drives it. So having conformally wrapped solar panels around the trunk of the vehicle reduces that little bit of complexity, and actually ends up being a little bit lighter too. So we can add a little more cargo and add a little bit more to other parts of the system. And then on the other side of the trunk is the thermal radiator. So we've got a fluid running through that, almost like an air conditioner. And that fluid is being pumped throughout various different points in the vehicle. Actually, earlier on, we heard a call from the core mentioning that the crew could adjust the hex or heat exchanger to the position that they wanted to control internal cabin temperature. So that part of the cabin air as it goes through the revitalization system is getting passed over that heat exchanger, and that allows the crew to keep it nice and comfortable inside the cabin.
I hope they both like the same temperature, because I like to keep it warm, and I hope they both like it cool or warm, or they can agree on temperature for the long ride home.
Well, taking a look at some of their interviews, I think Bob and Doug have expressed just how close of friends they are. So I'm sure it's something that they've worked out over time. I think earlier I took a look, and it was about 76 degrees Fahrenheit in the cabin. So definitely to my tastes.
Yeah, I could survive in that. And yeah, you mentioned they are very close. They were selected as part of the same astronaut class. So they went through astronaut training together, and ultimately remained very close friends, and now get to fly a once-in-a-lifetime mission like this.
Yeah. I mean, flying a test mission together with your best friend has got to be very fun. Of course, our favorite space dads here at SpaceX.
So just a look at these two mission controls. On the left, you have the International Space Station Flight Control Room in Houston, and that's the team that's monitoring and sending signals and controlling the International Space Station side of these operations. It is staffed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. We've always got someone in there protecting the astronauts in space, making sure that everything is working well on the International Space Station. And then on the right, Shiva, why don't you introduce us to the Mission Control Hawthorne?
Yeah, so this is Mission Control in Hawthorne. It's actually right behind us where we're standing here in Hawthorne. And in that room is a number of specialists, as well as the primary Dragon operators. Of course, if you've tuned in for some of our other webcasts, you've seen Mission Control as well. We use that same control room for Falcon missions. That's where the Falcon operators stand in. But today, the third row is where most of the primary operators are, and then we have a number of specialists sitting in other roles, folks who have really devoted the larger part of their careers and a lot of their expertise to understanding the nuances of the life support system or the propulsion system, and even, of course, the health and safety of the crew. We have a flight surgeon, actually a NASA flight surgeon, who is in that front row. And he's there as well to make sure that Bob and Doug, if they have any sort of complaints from a physiological perspective, that he can weigh in and help them stay healthy. So really a big team to help make sure that Bob and Doug get home safely, both from the vehicle performing well as their own individual health.
Yeah, and speaking of the vehicle, that vestibule pressure looking now at less than 0.3 psi, so getting down there as close as it can to a vacuum. But yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that the astronauts have a flight doctor. They have somebody who's specifically assigned to them for all of their pre-flight medical and their in-flight medical and their post-flight. Somebody that is able to speak with them at almost any time and conduct health checks and just wellness checks and make sure that everything is going well while they're in this very, very rough environment of space.
Yeah, I mean, among the cargo that they have aboard is emergency medical kits and actually medical sort of medicine and like trauma kits that they would use if there were a significant medical emergency. And so the flight surgeon can help them as they're working through first aid and give them specific instructions, since if they need to do anything in an emergency scenario, it's those two taking care of each other. And of course, when the hatch was open, the entire International Space Station crew of this expedition taking care of each other. So at this point, we're about 13 minutes away from the transition for undocking, and then about 5 minutes after that, we'll have the 2 undocking burns happen, really just short little bursts from those service section Dracos. We're expecting separation to happen around 4:35 p.m. Pacific time, just a few seconds before that. Heard a go, no-go poll earlier from the mission control teams that we were talking about earlier.
So just like it's during its approach to the International Space Station, Dragon's departure and deorbit is designed to be fully autonomous, so it requires no action from the crew on board. Station Commander Chris Cassidy, he won't be the prime for monitoring Dragon's departure. That'll be done by the crew on Dragon. They'll be able to monitor with these screens you see here, and they'll be backed up by flight controllers on the ground. But as always, Bob and Doug will have the ability to send commands manually to the vehicle if they need to.
And once the undocking sequence is complete, Dragon will then use its Draco engines. It'll thrust away from the station in a series of pretty carefully choreographed maneuvers or 4 departure burns to increase that distance between the 2 spacecraft. And then from there, it'll perform a phasing burn that will put it on the right trajectory to get back to Earth and the landing site.
Next on its home is deorbit, entry and landing, and that covers all operations after the final departure maneuver. That includes trunk separation, closure of the nose cone, deorbit burn, and deployment of the drogue and main parachutes, and finally, splashdown off the Florida coast, at which point our teams will recover Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley inside Crew Dragon from the water.
So at this point, a little bit ahead of schedule. We always put in a little bit of margin into the schedule in case there were any problems with, for example, the suits or if the leak check didn't quite go as planned. Right now, the planned time to perform the undocking commands to the spacecraft will be around 4:30 p.m. Pacific time, and we'll expect to see Dragon go through a number of state transitions as well as transitions of its life support system, and then shortly after we'll see those Dracos come to life very briefly, just to unstick ourselves from the space station, and then thrust away from where it's called home for the past 63 days.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, those will be the service section Draco thrusters. Those are what are used when the spacecraft is around the International Space Station. We don't want to use something as powerful as those nose cone thrusters, the forward bulkhead thrusters, I should say, just yet. But that's what we will see being used for the deorbit burn tomorrow.
Yeah, those forward bulkhead thrusters just a little bit more efficient because they can expand the propulsive gases a little bit more. Sort of the principle of providing thrust to a rocket vehicle is you burn some kind of propellant or have some kind of gas that you expend from the vehicle, and that mass that you're ejecting away from your launch or from your spacecraft is through Newton's laws pushing you and giving you some momentum. So those forward bulkhead Dracos, when we use the thrust out of those, the propulsive gases in there, we're able to more fully expand than we are on the service section Dracos. Gives us a little bit better performance, but of course they're pointed directly at the space station. Yeah. So any of that propulsive gas that we're shooting out from Dragon would of course go directly then to the space station, which is not ideal.
I just heard the call that Mission Control Houston is go
Dragon
for undocking.
SpaceX on the big loop. The final reconfigurations for undock are complete and nominal. The ground is go for undocking at the undocking sequence start time of 23:30 GMT. Please confirm your visors are down and that you are ready for undock and departure.
Dragon copies, go for undock on time. Our visors are down and we're ready for departure.
We copy all.
And we just heard the confirmation. Dragon is a go to undock. So now we are waiting for the undocking sequence to actually begin, and they are targeting that for 4:30 p.m. Pacific time, so it looks like 8 minutes from now. And once that begins, it'll take less than 5 minutes for Dragon to separate from the International Space Station, which has called home for 2 months now.
Now, the first step in the undocking sequence, which is, again, automatic, is for the umbilicals that are providing power, telemetry, and commanding capability between the space station Dragon for those to retract. Once those retract, we'll actually have Dragon perform an unlatch from the space station, releasing 12 hard capture hooks that are around the vestibule. Those hard capture hooks are what are providing that airtight seal around the vestibule, and they'll actually come in 2 separate phases. So we'll hear a call for 6 of those, and then we'll hear a call for all of those being detached. And then finally, after that entire process, which takes about 4.5 minutes, then Dragon will be ready to actually depart and push itself away and separate using its Draco thrusters.
Yeah, and so Dragon's initial departure from station is a little different from any of the other docked vehicles like the Soyuz, because that relies on springs to push them away from the docking port. In this case, Dragon will actually execute those 2 short thruster firings to undock. That uses a combination of those 12 Draco engines around the base of the capsule, with the first breaking any stiction between Dragon and the docking port, and the second slowly backing the spacecraft away. And so we're expecting the call for undocking sequence to begin in the next few minutes.
And the crew aboard, they will be able to see those transitions. So what will be happening here is the flight computers on the vehicle will issue themselves into a state when that command is issued. And actually on the crew displays, on every display, they've got a prominent location that shows what the current states are. They're also able to follow along and see what the state of the vehicle is. So those are the displays that they've got pulled up on their screen right now. That middle display actually has the cards that describe what they can expect to see, along with some inline telemetry that they're getting from the vehicle directly, as well as their current positioning relative to the International Space Station. And then they've also got some views on the side that are each of them in their respective displays that are showing a forward view of the spacecraft as well as the status of those docking hooks. At this point, the umbilicals both still installed because that command has not been issued. And the vestibule should be pretty close to vacuum.
Getting closer every second to that undocking command being sent. We're looking for that in about 5 minutes from now.
Taking a look at data here, I see the vestibule is reading as 0.1 psi. So definitely not very friendly to humans.
Everything moving smoothly throughout the day to bring us to this point with the crew ingressing Dragon, donning their suits, getting in their seats, closing the hatch, and then Chris Cassidy closing the A-Pass hatch on the station side, along with that Node 2 forward hatch, bringing that space down to as close to a vacuum as possible, and that's where we're at right now. Conducted some leak checks to ensure the seals between those hatches were solid. Everything looking good for an on-time departure today.
Pretty comfy in the cabin right now. You know, that vestibule is pretty near vacuum, but in the cabin it's actually pretty close to what we would see at sea level, and still about 76 degrees in there. So pretty comfortable. Of course, Bob and Doug are only partially seeing that. Earlier, they closed down their visors, and so the suits that they're wearing protect them in the event of a depressurization event. They also protect them if there was a fire on board, as they're made of fire-resistant materials. And so as we're getting to this critical step of separating from the space station, if something were to go wrong here, those suits would provide that critical life support to them, pressurizing if the cabin pressure were to unexpectedly drop. It's actually part of the reason why we've spent so long in this vestibule depressurization. The operators, both on the space station side and the mission control Hawthorne side, scrutinizing the data for any indication of a leak through the forward hatch. Of course, that leak check performed earlier with no findings, showing the vehicle is nominal and ready for undocking.
And as once we mentioned, that undocking will take a few minutes before we actually see the separation occur. But once the command is sent, those 12 latches will be retracted. The umbilical will be disconnected. Dragon is already on internal power, however. It's not receiving any power from the International Space Station. But once that umbilical is retracted, those hooks are removed. Be looking for those 2 short bursts to send Dragon on its way, and then things will speed up with those departure burns afterward. Just a couple of minutes away from that on-time undocking. That'll be 4:30 p.m. Pacific, 11:30 p.m. GMT, or the time that the astronauts use aboard the International Space Station. looking for the undocking command to be sent in just about 30 seconds.
And again, a quick preview of what we expect to happen. Umbilicals will retract, then we'll see those docking hooks disconnect, and then we'll actually see those undocking burns followed pretty shortly after by a departure burn.
Dragon SpaceX, undock sequence commanded.
Pepper copies.
So that undocking sequence right on time.
And that was 4:30 p.m. Pacific time, 11:30 p.m. GMT. The umbilical now retracting. The International Space Station flying 263 statute miles over Namibia in Africa.
Dragon SpaceX, umbilical demate complete and nominal.
There's confirmation of the umbilicals retracted, so no longer receiving power or data or commanding from the International Space Station. And there's a view on your screen of Dragon currently in eclipse. Gary, how's it looking from mission control at Johnson?
We're looking good, Shiva. We are now inside the undocking sequence. Good umbilical retraction. Standing by for the driving of those hooks. There's 12 hooks that will be released in 2 gangs of 6. Standing by for the driving of the hooks. Here we have good motion on the primary set of hooks. Again, first set of hooks driving the navigation light, the forward end of Dragon clearly visible from this view from one of the Japanese cameras. Again, we are inside of the undocking sequence. Now good umbilical retraction, and we're driving the first set of hooks.
Dragon SpaceX, first set of hooks open and nominal.
Copy nominal hooks in the first set.
The first 6 hooks have completed their driving first set down. The second set is now driving. We're now committed to undock. Seeing good motion on that second set of hooks. Continuing to drive. These will be the final set of hooks. There's 6 of them holding Dragon into place now. Afterwards, we'll conduct 2 undocking burns to physically separate Dragon.
Dragon SpaceX, all hooks open and nominal.
All hooks open.
Dragon departing.
Dragon SpaceX, separation confirmed.
Separation
Great burns. Physical separation 4:35 p.m. Pacific. Thrusters looking good. Counting down to a nominal departure burn 0 coming up shortly.
Dragon SpaceX, depart burn 0 complete.
Copy complete. We're visors up.
And you heard depart burn 0 complete, that 12-second firing, moving Dragon slightly faster away from the International Space Station using those service section Dracos. And with that, Bob and Doug have concluded their stay aboard the International Space Station. They're on their way back to planet Earth. Confirms a physical separation at 4:35 p.m. Pacific as the station and Dragon were flying 267 statute miles over Johannesburg, South Africa. 2 good undocking burns and a nominal departure burn 0. Next departure burn coming up in about 5 minutes. We'll be monitoring Crew Dragon throughout the departure sequence, but with Dragon flying free, that'll do it from us here in Mission Control Houston. Godspeed, Bob and Doug. To take you through the rest of the departure sequence, we'll send you back over to Hawthorne.
Thanks, Gary. Departure burn 0 sets Crew Dragon, Endeavour, and Bob and Doug on their journey home. Dragon ship Endeavour is now on a trajectory to head up and over the station before additional maneuvers will change its orbital path to take it below and in front of the station. Dragon will autonomously accomplish that through 3 additional departure burns, with that next one coming up in just a couple of minutes to get Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley well away from the space station and on their way home.
Beautiful view. Just had a beautiful view there of the relative navigation sensors providing an infrared view of the International Space Station as Bob and Doug drift away from it. And of course, as they are drifting away, going into that slightly higher orbit, just because of balancing the force of gravity along with their centripetal acceleration, they will move a little bit slower than the space station. And so we'll expect space station to sort of drift ahead, and then as they conduct those additional burns, getting out of the approach ellipsoid and the keep out sphere, then they will come back down below space station with their apogee being about 10 kilometers below space station and slowly reducing their perigee.
Next up in just a couple of minutes, scheduled for 4:40 p.m. Pacific time and 11:40 p.m. GMT will be depart burn 1. That's a 20-second burn to further increase the opening rate between Crew Dragon and the International Space Station.
Yeah, and that view, what we just previously had, and you can actually see it on the right-hand screen of Bob's display, is a relative navigation sensor that's providing an infrared view from the forward hatch of Dragon, looking back towards the forward module of the International Space Station. So that's where Dragon has been for the last 63 days. Coming up in less than a minute is departure burn number 1. This burn coming just about 5 minutes after separation, and this is going to increase that opening rate between the space station and Dragon.
And separation occurred on time today, as with everything else occurring on schedule, sending Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley back toward Earth, back toward home.
So very, very exciting moment. We should expect to hear a call out here for departure burn number 1. Departure burn number 1 is pretty short. It only lasts about 21 seconds, but it's the burn that's going to get us on our way up, out, and away through the keep-out sphere and through the approach ellipsoid. Again, the keep-out sphere, about 200-meter sphere around the International Space Station, and the approach ellipsoid, 4 by 4 by 2 kilometer ellipse. If you imagine 2 Central Parks in New York City next to each other, that's about how big that is. Just guidance references for visiting vehicles.
And we're seconds away now from departure burn 1. These are autonomous burns. Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley are not pushing any buttons to make this happen. These are programmed into Dragon, and we will be looking for that in just a few seconds from now.
That's a view from the space station. Those 2 lights, the green light is the view that on the right-hand side of the Dragon vehicle. That would be the side that Bob Behnken was sitting on, and the red light, the side that Doug Hurley was sitting on. It's actually made pretty quick work getting away from the station. Gonna look up some data, see if I can get the actual distance to station right now.
And departure burn 1 has begun, that 20-second burn. This will also take it outside of the keep-out sphere and outside of the approach ellipsoid, and after complete.
Dragon SpaceX, depart burn 1 complete. Nominal burn, you are go to doff your suits per procedure 4.012. Reminder that the ground will be deactivating the big loop following exit from the approach ellipsoid, which is approximately 12 to 14 minutes from now.
Okay. Station Endeavor on the big loop.
Go ahead, Endeavor.
Chris, just can't thank you enough. It's been an honor and a privilege to be part of Expedition 63 with you, Anatoly, and Yvonne. It's been a great 2 months, and we appreciate all you've done as a crew to help us prove out Dragon on its maiden flight. I'd also like to thank Zeb and his team in Mission Control in Houston for the incredible amount of work they did to make the dock to op successful for Dragon, and also the teams at SpaceX that keep us going towards the end of our mission that we look forward to splashdown tomorrow. I'd also like to wish you a great success on the rest of your expedition and a safe flight home in the fall. Take care, friend.
Endeavor,
Thank you, Chris.
Safe.
Thank you, Anatoly. Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you, Houston, and thank you, SpaceX.
Endeavor Station, Bob and Doug, wholeheartedly agree with those sentiments. It's been a real pleasure. It's been an honor to serve with you. Safe travels and have a successful landing. Endeavor's a great ship. Godspeed.
Endeavor copies all. Thanks, Chris.
And we just heard some kind words exchanged between Crew Dragon Endeavor with Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley now on their way home.
ISS and Dragon on the big loop. Endeavor has exited the keep-out sphere. See you guys when you're back home.
Endeavor copy.
Behnken and Hurley leaving behind 3 people aboard the International Space Station that will return this October. That's Station Commander Chris Cassidy, Anatoly Ivanishin, and Yvonne Wagner of Roscosmos. So you just heard they exited the keep-out sphere. That's an imaginary sphere, 200 meters in diameter, and that is around the space station. So it's one of the several safety zones set up to govern any visiting spacecraft either arriving or departing the station. Before moving into the keep-out sphere, spacecraft have to be configured where they would not cross that boundary for at least 4 orbits, even if, as we mentioned, the spacecraft were to, for some reason, lose all of its maneuvering capabilities.
Yeah, and that capability, really what we're looking to hear is that the spacecraft is what's called on what's a I'm having such a hard time saying that.
You'll get there.
It's on a 24-hour safe free drift trajectory. And that's what the call that we're hoping to hear from. So exactly as you mentioned, Leah, if we were to completely lose commanding authority over the spacecraft, we would want to make sure that we wouldn't potentially re-interact with the International Space Station in an uncontrolled way. And so these burns helping us to get out and away from the space station in a way that we could, if something were to go catastrophically wrong on the vehicle, protect the crew aboard the space station, of course the crew aboard the spacecraft until you were able to recover. Of course, Dragon spacecraft has been really rock solid this entire mission and has a lot of redundancy into it. So that scenario is pretty unlikely, but it's a good safety standard that we design all of our spacecraft to.
And this departure burn 0 and 1, as we mentioned, is bringing Dragon up and over the International Space Station. It's not just making a straight journey home. That will be determined later once the phasing burn is complete, and then the deorbit burn, which commits us to leaving space, to bringing Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley back into Earth. The next...
SpaceX Dragon on Dragon to ground comm check with the cabin mic.
I hear you loud and clear on Dragon to ground. How me?
Loud and clear, Anna.
As we heard, they are now testing out the cabin mic, so they may be beginning to doff their suits, take off their suits, which is allowed now that the first 2 departure burns have been completed. And the next is scheduled for 5:27 p.m. Pacific time. That'll be depart burn 2, and that'll be 12:27 a.m. GMT. So it's really the middle of the night for the space station crew right now, and they'll be getting ready to go to sleep pretty soon. But our astronauts are awake for several more hours before they get their sleep period later.
Of course, they all got a chance to take a quick sleep shifting nap to be alert and awake for these operations. And you know, as you mentioned, the crew are in the middle of doffing or getting out of their suits. That was a pretty dynamic period of time around the station, a time where there could have been a potential depressurization, or if there were any problems with the thruster, we would want the crew suited. Of course, with that big burn out of the way and Dragon now on a confirmed trajectory away from the space station on its way out close to exiting the approach ellipsoid, Bob and Doug can get out of those spacesuits and get into something a little bit more comfortable. And that test step of verifying the cabin mic, the spacesuits actually have 2 microphones in them just towards the near the jaw, actually in the base of the helmet. And so with Bob and Doug removing those spacesuits, they're testing their cabin mic just to make sure that they still have good communications with the crew operations responsible engineer here in Hawthorne. So we should expect a few more calls here as Dragon moves away from the approach ellipsoid. We heard a couple of calls from the Capcom as well about deactivating the big loop, so to speak, and transitioning to Dragon to ground. The big loop is a comm network that connects flight controllers and Mission Control Houston, the International Space Station crew, visiting vehicles, and of course, like our Mission Control team here in Hawthorne, all together on one comm loop so we can all communicate with one another if anything needs immediate attention. As we step out of integrated operations or joint operations with the International Space Station, we'll transition into mission control here in Hawthorne, having mission authority, and transition all of those calls to the Dragon to ground loop.
Yeah, so life on space station is kind of back to normal now that Dragon has departed, and they are still monitoring the departure. The crew on board Crew Dragon is specifically, and I can imagine that the astronauts aboard the space station might be looking out and getting a final last view of Dragon before it returns to Earth. Maybe in those bay windows, that cupola window we have on the International Space Station. Now, as we mentioned, Dragon is outside the keep-out sphere, and it is a little more than 500 meters away from the International Space Station. So we'll be looking for it to exit the approach ellipsoid coming up here in about 6 minutes.
Yeah, right now, Dragon moving away just under 1 meter per second, or close to like 3 feet per second away from the space station. And as it really starts to get further and further away, that speed will pick up a little bit until we get into an orbit where eventually we will have our highest point of our orbit be about 10 kilometers below the space station. And coming up after that approach ellipsoid, exit, they'll also have 3 more burns scheduled for today, so 2 more departure burns as well as a departure phasing burn. And then that should button up the activities, major activities for today, and Bob and Doug will hopefully be able to get some rest before a pretty exciting day tomorrow.
Yes, I can imagine they are very excited. And tomorrow they can they'll wake up, and then several more milestones to look forward to, including, as we mentioned, that deorbit burn, that final commitment to bringing them home. Because if there were a change in potentially the weather over the next several hours, we would still be able to have Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley in Earth's orbit, and they have enough crew supplies on board that they could stay there until a couple of days. That way we would have an opportunity for the weather to clear or for us to find another splashdown site. But everything's looking good for us to come home to Pensacola tomorrow.
Right now on your screen, views of Mission Control. On the right-hand side, this team is Mission Control in Houston, and on the left-hand side of your screen is Mission Control in Hawthorne. Currently still in joint operations as we're still in the approach ellipsoid, and as we transition out of that 4 kilometer by 2 kilometer ellipse, we will transition mission authority to the mission director here in Hawthorne. While we've been in integrated operations and while we've been attached to the space station, any commands, any operations that we wanted to do on the Dragon spacecraft, of course, we're getting permission from the flight director in Houston to conduct those commands, because the flight control team in Houston really responsible for the health and safety of the crew aboard the International Space Station, as well as the safety and performance of the International Space Station. It's kind of wild to think about it. Sometimes I think about the International Space Station as a destination, but it's really a spaceship. And in fact, earlier this, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, the space station had yawed completely around by adjusting its orbit, and so it was flying backwards, so to speak. So it's a spacecraft just like Dragon, just bigger.
Oh, definitely a spacecraft. It's actually an orbiting laboratory, and so while they were on board, we talked about some of the science that Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley conducted, and while they were there, they completed 114 hours, approximately, of scientific research aboard the International Space Station, and it's really amazing how much of that benefits life on Earth. The space station obviously is in microgravity, and that gives us an opportunity to test things and to look a little closer at phenomenon that we can't when we're here on Earth. And so the International Space Station has provided countless medical advances and technological advances for us over these past 20 years. And as we mentioned earlier, this is the 20th anniversary of the International Space Station this year. And so it's a big milestone. We'll be celebrating that later in November. And that means there have been people living in space continuously for 20 years. So that's quite a feat. I love that it's international. I love that this is just such a good example of how when we work together, we accomplish something that at one time no one could have ever dreamed of.
Yeah, just reading some of the books by former crew members, I know they like to talk about the food aboard the space station and the sort of the international cultural events that they do between crews. They really consider themselves a big family, and those kind words that we heard between Bob, Doug, and the station crew as leaving sort of shows just how close they became over just a short period of time, just a couple of months. Of course, I'm sure they all knew each other pretty well from training in Houston.
Yeah, but something about being there with a common goal, and those are your family when you're there, you know. And so, of course, our astronauts get the opportunity to speak with their family pretty regularly because we want them to not get too homesick. Of course, they get a pretty good view in exchange. But yes, so we actually are coming up very shortly now. It looks like about a minute until we exit that approach ellipsoid and joint operations end between Mission Control Houston and Mission Control Hawthorne, which is just right behind us.
And again, that approach ellipsoid, a 4 kilometer by 2 kilometer by 2 kilometer imaginary ellipse around the space station, really designed as a marker as spacecraft, as their trajectories enter into the space around the space station. They need to coordinate their operations with the flight control teams at Johnson Space Center. The way that we do that is, of course, through the loops and the nets that we have. So on your screen, a shot of those 2 mission control centers, and also through a set of what we call flight rules. So both mission control teams teams will establish operating principles, philosophies, procedures, sometimes even going down to specific failures. For example, if a specific engine was failed, or if a certain attitude capability was lost, or even the state of the life support system on board the vehicle, they'll come up with go, no-go criteria that are very specifically analyzed. And when it comes time to actually perform the operation, they'll check those lists against the health of the vehicle, and then make those go, no-go calls before performing operations in close proximity with one another.
So the next call we do expect to hear up to the crew is that they will have exited the approach ellipsoid. Everything occurring on time for Dragon. And the International Space Station currently flying over the Indian Ocean, 269 statute miles above us all, about to come up on the southern coast of Australia.
And really the next major event for Dragon will be around 5:27 Pacific time, or that'll be tomorrow morning at 12:27 UTC, and that will be the next departure burn. So a little bit of time before any significant milestones.
And we are outside of the approach ellipsoid. So now that we are outside of the approach ellipsoid, as we said, everything happening like clockwork today for their departure.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop. Dragon has exited the approach ellipsoid and is on a safe free drift trajectory. Houston will be taking down the big loop shortly, and expect ISS audio traffic to cease.
Dragon copies on the big loop.
So with that exit of the approach ellipsoid, or the AE, that other imaginary three-dimensional ellipsoid measuring 4 kilometers by 2 kilometers, in the same family as the keep-out sphere, as we mentioned, that means that they are now 24 hours safe in a free drift trajectory. So if the spacecraft were to lose maneuvering capabilities, it wouldn't cross into the approach ellipsoid. We heard that call from the core here on the ground in Mission Control Hawthorne up to the crew aboard Crew Dragon Endeavour.
The crew acknowledging that call. They typically do some comm checks on Dragon to ground when they transition out of the big loop. Of course, we heard those earlier while they were doing their suit doffing. Suit doffing, again, being where they remove their spacesuits, get out of them, and then they'll transition into something a little bit more comfortable, probably a polo and maybe just some pants. And really, they'll just be in a monitoring mode until the next major event, which is the depart burn number 2. That's scheduled for about 30 minutes from now. And that depart burn 2 will really increase the rate away from space station and start reducing both the apogee and perigee of Dragon's current orbit. And following that, there'll be an additional depart burn as well as the phasing burn. Coming up later on in today's broadcast, the phasing burn being actually a much larger burn than these 2 departure burns, on the order of 6 minutes.
And so that departure burn 2 will be the longest one we've seen so far today, and that'll be a 43-second burn. It will send Dragon down and lower its perigee, the lowest point of its orbit, to beneath the station. It'll move down and out in front at perigee.
And so we can, on your screen, is sort of where we're conducting this burn. So depart burn 2 at the apogee, performing an orbital burn or imparting velocity to the spacecraft at the highest point of the orbit is actually the most efficient way to move the opposite end of the orbit. So in this case, because we want to bring our perigee, or lowest point of our orbit, down a little bit further, we're trying to conduct that burn at the apogee and get the most bang for your buck and most mileage out of that propellant.
They will they'll have depart burn 3. That'll be a 41-second burn. So as we mentioned earlier, it's kind of like a co-elliptic burn, and it will keep Dragon always down below the International Space Station. Later tonight, we'll be looking for a phasing burn. That'll be the longest one we've seen so far at over 6 minutes. And it'll put Crew Dragon on the proper orbital path to line it up with the splashdown zone. And then eventually we will have our deorbit burn tomorrow. We'll see the nose cone close. We'll see the trunk jettison, and they will come on home looking for a splashdown tomorrow in the Gulf of Mexico, specifically at our Pensacola landing site.
Yeah, the departure burn, taking a look at the data, expected around 10:48 Pacific time plus 7. Let's see, that would be around 5 o'clock in the morning or so.
For GMT.
GMT. And again, that's the last major burn plan for tonight. That'll happen right before Bob and Doug end up getting some shut-eye for the night. They'll get about 8 hours of sleep, and then tomorrow morning get a wake up from the core to get them started on preparation steps for the final burn of the mission, which will be that deorbit burn. And then hopefully a successful re-entry.
I don't know if you heard when they arrived on the International Space Station, Commander Chris Cassidy asked Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley how the ride was, and of course they said it was very smooth, and asked how if they got any sleep, and they said yes, they did get some sleep. So I'm hoping they get the same opportunity tonight that will leave them very refreshed and ready for their splashdown tomorrow, their reunion with their families, and tomorrow they will also arrive back in Houston. So they will fly back to Ellington Field, and that's part of the Johnson Space Center. It's where we do a lot of our astronaut training in the T-38 aircraft. And so they will arrive back there tomorrow, have a welcome with their families, and then it'll be, 3 people on the International Space Station until October.
And that's a pretty busy day for them, because I think tomorrow morning they'll get up around, I think I know the time in Pacific, they'll get up around, I want to say 5 a.m. Pacific time, and if the splashdown time is around noon. And then if they're flying to their final site near Ellington Field, that's a pretty packed day considering they've been up that long.
Oh yes, absolutely. I think it's definitely one of the most dynamic days of the mission, with the deorbit burn, with the splashdown, and then eventually flying back, being recovered in the ocean, and then getting to see your family after 63 days. It has to be pretty exciting.
We were talking a little bit earlier. Looks like no call that time. One thing we are expecting here is the teams here in Mission Control will be conducting a go, no-go poll for the upcoming departure burn, just to ensure that the vehicle systems remain healthy. Before each of these burns, the core, the crew operations responsible engineer, will give a call up to the crew to let them know if the Mission Control team believes Dragon is healthy for the burn. And then after those burns as well, we expect a call from the core to provide a quick status update on performance of the system and whether the burn was nominal. Some of the things we're looking for there are, of course, performance of the engines, as well as the amount of impulse transmitted to the vehicle. The navigation officer, of course, paying close attention to the amount of momentum transferred to Dragon, as well as the current orbit as described by onboard navigation sensors. So all part of the responsibilities of the Mission Control team. That burn expected about 25 minutes from now. That's 5:27 p.m. Pacific time, or about 12:27 UTC. 12 a.m., so 12:27 a.m. UTC.
So we don't have a signal from Dragon at this moment, so we're not getting those views that we had earlier, but we are taking your questions. So if you're watching and you are on social media, specifically Twitter, feel free to use the hashtag #AskNASA, and we will try to answer your question here on air. This one comes from Amal, who asks how much time it will take for the Dragon spacecraft to reach Earth after undocking from the International Space Station. Well, Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley have begun that journey, and they are on their way, scheduled for splashdown tomorrow at 11:48 a.m. Pacific time, and that would be 6:48 GMT or Greenwich Mean Time.
Dragon SpaceX on Dragon to ground. Friendly heads up that your audio destination is on ISS. So if you are calling us, we will not hear you.
So, with that splashdown tomorrow, it's looking like about a 19-hour mission for Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley from the time they undock to the time they splash down.
Of course, that time can be brought in and made a little bit shorter. For this mission, we opted to give them a 19-hour opportunity, and that gives them a chance to get some rest.
And SpaceX, say again for Endeavour.
Yes, just wanted to give you a heads up that your audio destination was on ISS, but I see you've swapped that over to ground now. We just wanted to make sure that if you were calling us, we would hear you.
Okay, Anna, thank you. I appreciate the heads up.
That fuzzy little dot is a view from the International Space Station looking at Dragon, currently on its way away from the International Space Station.
Speaking of the International Space Station, another Ask NASA question, this one from Colin, who asks, how do you keep time on the ISS? Well, you've heard us working to convert that in our heads. The International Space Station uses GMT, or Greenwich Mean Time. It's kind of the in-the-middle space between Russia and Houston, and so since those are two of the major partners in International Space Station operations, we use that time aboard.
Some cool views from the cameras on board the International Space Station. And one other note there, GMT is also sometimes referred to as UTC, or Universal Coordinated Time. They both mean the same thing, just slightly different nomenclature. And you may hear some of those calls over the nets and from the core.
It's now been 30 minutes since Crew Dragon separated from the International Space Station, an on-time departure. Separation coming at 4:35 p.m. Central, 11:30 p.m. GMT. It has completed its first two departure burns, Depart Burn 0 and Depart Burn 1. And the next will happen in about 22 minutes. We'll be looking for Depart Burn 2. The astronauts, Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley, are now out of their spacesuits. They won't need to put those back on until tomorrow, just before the deorbit burn.
So another question on social media right now lines up well with the view we have of Dragon. From Michelle, why is Dragon glowing right now? And actually, Dragon isn't glowing. What we're seeing is the reflection of the sun. So right now, both Dragon and the International Space Station not in the Earth's shadow. And just from this view on the camera, compared to everything else being so dark in the background of space, Dragon is just coming out looking a little bit whitewashed just from the exposure. So not glowing, but just seeing the reflection of the sun as we sort of adjust the white balancing. So next expected burn is departure burn number 3. That's expected at 6:14 p.m. Pacific time, or that would be about 1:14 a.m. UTC or GMT or Greenwich Mean Time. And again, as mentioned previously, 41.8-second burn that will use a similar combination of service section and forward bulkhead Draco thrusters. Those service section thrusters to really provide attitude control, make sure that the forward bulkhead thrusters are pointed at the correct location, and then those forward bulkhead Dracos providing the majority of the impulse for that burn to reduce, to finalize us in an orbit that is co-elliptic with the station, so on a similar ellipse, but with the highest point being about 10 kilometers below the current space station altitude.
And speaking of those forward bulkhead thrusters, we have another Ask NASA question. So a reminder, if you are watching on social media, on Twitter, go ahead and use the hashtag AskNASA. Send us your question, and we'll see if we can get that answered on air. So this one's from Gary. He wants to know why the nose cone can't be closed now, and it's because we're not done using it yet. That won't be closed until tomorrow after the deorbit burn. So we've seen those first 2-3 burns now accomplished, and looking forward to departure burn 3 coming up next. And they will once again use those forward bulkhead thrusters that are located under the nose cone. So don't want to cover those up just yet, but it will be closed prior to reentry.
Yeah, another note there is there's also a number of navigation sensors beneath the nose cone that help Dragon know where it's pointing in space, and also help it communicate with those tracking and data relay satellites. So not only is it for those burns, and we have a couple of big ones left before this mission is complete, but also to help Dragon know just where is it around planet Earth.
We've got a question from Hurricane Force, who asks, how can kids work toward being future astronauts or work with NASA? That's a great question, and I will give some advice that the astronauts give. I've always heard them say to pick something that you love to do, because the path to being an astronaut is very, very difficult, and it requires a lot of studying and learning and growing in your field, and so that's much easier to do if you enjoy what you're doing. And so typically we would encourage you to pick something in the science, technology, engineering, or math career or field, and then pursue a career there. And then we have astronaut applications open every few years or so. We pick just around a dozen astronauts to come and go through 2 years of training, which will set them up for readiness of future missions. But working with NASA has a lot of different career opportunities. Obviously, I work in communications, and so NASA needs people to help tell the story. So even if maybe STEM is not necessarily your thing, you can still have a great part of NASA and be part of the NASA family.
I think the best piece of advice I've heard from crew members and otherwise is to stay curious. And if there's something that sounds really interesting to you, don't take someone else's word for it. Go do your own research, stay curious about it, go learn about it, and you will probably become the person who knows more than anyone else about it. That's a real good way to get to work on cool things like this. Well, this is an interesting question, and I'm not sure I know the answer to it. This is a question from Lucas the Hunter. What does space smell like?
I personally haven't been, so I haven't had the opportunity to try it. But I've heard a few different things from the astronauts. One has said it smells like burnt cookies or burnt steak. So the common theme there is it smells a little like something that burned. So, like I said, I haven't gotten to try it out.
Dragon SpaceX, no rush, but please let us know when it is okay to come back on board with video.
So the core there, just relaying to the crew. We have cameras, of course, aboard Dragon that we've been looking at earlier. Relaying to the crew that we've had those off for their privacy so they could doff their suits, and requesting if we could come back aboard.
And SpaceX, you're welcome to come on board at this time, and we've just wrapped up our timer for suit drying.
Copy all. Thank you so much.
And Doug there referring to the drying time for the suits. So, of course, any perspiration, any wetness in the suits just from having people in them, we want to try to dry that out, make sure that the suits are nice and clean, wouldn't have any possibility of getting kind of gross or building up any sort of microbes. In fact, when we got first to station, we did a longer drying period, and the crew wiped down the suits with some cleaning wipes just to make sure that there was nothing that would grow in there for the 2 months that we were on station, and conducting a similar operation right now.
So another walkthrough of everything that's happened today. If you're joining us now, or if you weren't here for the start of our broadcast, we joined the International Space Station while the astronauts were still on board the space station with their other 3 counterparts. That's NASA's Chris Cassidy and Anatoly Ivanishin and Ivan Wagner of Roscosmos. And then we saw the crew board the Crew Dragon, say, farewell, and don their suits or put their suits on and close that hatch of Crew Dragon, followed up shortly by NASA astronaut Chris Cassidy closing the hatch on the space station side, known as the APAS hatch. We then stepped into the vestibule depressurization. That's the space in between the hatches that was exposed to vacuum whenever Crew Dragon departed. And we saw an on-time departure. Separation occurring at 4:35 p.m. Pacific time. That's 11:30 p.m. GMT, or the time used aboard the International Space Station. We had those 2 short bursts using the thrusters on Dragon and the umbilical detaching, those hooks releasing, the 12 hooks releasing Dragon from its home for the past couple of months. So after that, we saw the first 3 departure burns of Crew Dragon, those first 2 bringing it up and over the International Space Station. The astronauts were then able to take off their spacesuits after that burn was completed, and then we just saw departure burn 2, which has lowered Dragon's perigee and brought it down below the International Space Station at all times. So next up for us will be departure burn 3. We're looking for that at 6:14 p.m. Pacific, 1:14 a.m. GMT.
Been a pretty busy day for Bob and Doug aboard Dragon. They managed to. There's actually a view of inside the cabin. So Bob and Doug out of their spacesuits. You can actually see one of their spacesuits. It's that sort of white and gray item on the left-hand side of the screen, and then it looks like that might be Bob on the right-hand side of the screen. And we're looking at a view. You can kind of see the cargo, so the seats in front of them. Looks like they've got a spacesuit in the way of this camera. But beneath the seats, they've got some storage room where we've got about 150 kilograms of cargo. A lot of that, more than half of that actually, is scientific experiments and samples coming from the the research program aboard the International Space Station, which is, of course, a national laboratory. You actually had a number earlier. I think Bob and Doug combined had done
114 hours, approximately 114 hours of science in the lab while they were on the International Space Station. And of course, that doesn't count towards the upgrades that were completed outside with those battery changes that enable us to keep going further. But yes, it of course tripled the amount of time we were able to do, because that's the U.S. lab. And Chris Cassidy was, prior to the arrival of Crew Dragon, doing all this work on his own. And so having Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley come on board for a couple of months really expanded the amount of scientific research that was conducted during that time.
Yeah, some cool views of the interior of the cabin. We got a sort of a sweep around of the cameras. So right now we're looking at a camera that would sit ordinarily, or sits ordinarily, right behind the crew members, looking up at their displays. The view that we actually had previous to this was a view looking towards Doug Hurley's seat. And actually, when on the uphill portion of the mission, we got a quick tour of the interior of Dragon from Bob and Doug, and they gave us some insight and a quick tour of the cabin. And it looks like Bob just putting his suit away in his suit storage bag, suit drying complete. They were wearing those suits earlier, just in case they needed to. The suits really for their protection if there was a depressurization or a fire in the spacecraft. Now that we're past some of those dynamic moments close to the space station, the risk of one of those events is pretty low. The suit storage bags, though, of course, will be kept in close proximity, so if there were any sort of anomaly later on in the mission, Bob and Doug could quickly get into them. And pretty cool. They're actually pretty much a single-piece design. They can be put on within less than 15 minutes.
As you mentioned, I think you made a good call. It looked like a polo and some khakis to me. So they're now out of those suits and able to relax until before the deorbit burn tomorrow.
Probably a lot of Velcro on those as well, I'm guessing. I know on space station side, they tend to have a lot of Velcro on pretty much every surface.
Yes, it's interesting. The astronauts use Velcro on, their pant legs will have strips of Velcro, and anything that they work with, their spoon or some, like their drink bags might have a little spot of Velcro on the other side, so that way if they need to put it down, they can't really put it down, and they don't want it to float away and become lost in the recesses of the vastness of the International Space Station, and so they can just tack it to their little Velcro spot on their little pants leg and come right back to it.
Yeah, and you might wonder how something would float away. There's, actually a couple of things. One, it's really hard to impart something with no force. If you've watched videos of crew members on the space station sort of playing with their food or playing with drink bags, they might put something and it'll start to twist and turn, move. They'll grab it, move it close to them, and it'll start to twist and move. And the other, there's actually a life support reason for doing that as well. As the crew members are exhaling carbon dioxide, unless you have really good circulation in the life support system from all the fans and scrubbers on board your spacecraft, that carbon dioxide will tend to sit and bubble and create pockets of unbreathable air. So the life support system is also providing a lot of positive pressure and moving gases around the cabin just to make sure that we are circulating and revitalizing that air, running it through our scrubbers, and of course regular injections of oxygen so it's nice and breathable.
Really cool views inside Crew Dragon. And it has now been over an hour since they left the International Space Station. So much has happened in that time, with obviously the on-dock burns, the departure burns, and exiting the keep-out sphere, approach ellipsoid, the termination of joint activities between Houston and Hawthorne, and now the crew settling in for the rest of the ride until tomorrow.
Yeah, you can kind of see what we're talking about here. Suit helmet, sort of, as Doug is putting away his suit, kind of floating a little bit. Nice, cool view into that clear visor. That visor actually creates a sealing surface as well, so those suits will keep pressure in them in the event of a depressurization.
It looks like we have a good Ask NASA question. I think it's tailor-made for you, Shiva.
Yeah, this is a good question. So a question from Anir. My 9-year-old son has a question. What is Dragon's outer layer made of, like the material you used to make it? So I think what Anir might be referring to here is our heat shield material and our thermal material. The external surfaces of Dragon are actually made of a material called pica, which I think is phenolic impregnated carbon ablator. So pica material is something that that actually NASA developed, and Dragon and SpaceX have actually done some work to upgrade it over both the crew program as well, over the cargo program and as well as over the crew program. And so we're using something called Pica 3, I believe, on the Dragon spacecraft. A cool example of kind of the partnership between the NASA teams and the SpaceX team in developing the spacecraft.
It looks like the windows outside or to the outside of Crew Dragon are a little bit dark now, and that is the case because the International Space Station is now in an orbital nighttime, or I should say Crew Dragon Endeavour, flying over the Atlantic Ocean, about 261 statute miles above us all. As I mentioned earlier, the space station orbits the Earth sees 16 sunrises and sunsets a day, so currently constantly moving at 17,500 miles an hour, and Crew Dragon is about on that same trajectory at this moment.
Yeah, again, this next upcoming burn, which is scheduled for about, let's see, 28 minutes from now. This next upcoming burn will put us into a co-elliptical orbit with the station. So all that means is that the station is on a slightly elliptical orbit, mostly a circle, but not quite. And Dragon will be on a very similar ellipse to the space station, but just with its highest point of orbit about 10 kilometers below the space station. Right now it looks like we're flying right over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, just off the, well, not quite just off the coast, west coast of Africa, but off the west coast of Africa.
One fact I love about the International Space Station, perhaps not, maybe not Crew Dragon Endeavour as we discussed. You might be able to see that with a telescope, but for the International Space Station, you can see that with the naked eye. You don't need a telescope. It's the third brightest object in the night sky, and so if you go to spotthestation.nasa.gov, you get the chance to see when the space station is flying over your area. So it's pretty amazing if you get the chance to look it up, and tells you when you can go outside and where to look in the sky to see the space station fly over. Every time I get the opportunity, I love to go and try and see it, and I wave at whoever is on board the International Space Station. It's funny for me to think that they're only about 250 miles above us. Of course, they're in outer space, but 250 miles is not that far when you think about it on Earth. So
that's a pretty short road trip, honestly.
Exactly.
But pretty hard to get there. Need a lot of thrust and power to get through that, and that's why we need something like Falcon 9 to be able to get us into orbit. And of course, once you're in orbit, that's not the end of the story. The Dragon spacecraft as well, in this case, had to provide quite a bit of thrust to then rendezvous with the International Space Station. Got a question here from Anna about how the crew can configure the capsule for sleep. So can the crew turn off the lights in the Dragon capsule to sleep? And they can, actually. As part of their sleep configuration processes, the crew can control the cabin lighting. They actually have some covers as well that they'll put on those windows. So there's two windows on either side of the side hatch, and of course there's a window that looks through the forward hatch, and crew will put some covers on those just so they don't get woken up by the orbital sunrise. Right now, I believe, as you mentioned, we're currently in orbital nighttime, so a little bit dark in the cabin without those lights.
It would really mess with your circadian rhythm if every 45 minutes you were getting a bright flash of light for 45 minutes.
And kind of another fun thing, too, is the crew do have a white noise generator on board, so they can also turn that on if they want to try to mask some of the sound of space and get a little bit more rest. Seemed like they enjoyed their sleep period.
It sounds like I would sleep pretty good on Crew Dragon Endeavour, honestly. To have a white noise generator, that's a nice perk.
So this might be a question for you, Leah. Can you actually see fireworks from the International Space Station?
You know, I'm not positive about fireworks, but one thing you can see is lightning. And so that makes me think that fireworks might be visible from the International Space Station, in which case I can't help but wonder if maybe they got a real show about a month ago for 4th of July. But yes, they can see lightning on the International Space Station, and especially it's just amazing to see the photos they send back of the forces of nature. I can't remember if it was Bob Behnken or Doug Hurley this morning that posted a picture of Hurricane Isaias, and, you know, it just looks like a monster on Earth.
Luckily, moving away from our landing sites, though, that was actually one of the concerns for the flight control teams. We were monitoring the weather, checking if Hurricane Isaias was going to move into the Gulf of Mexico or whether it was going to move up the eastern seaboard into the Atlantic. And until we had some certainty on that, we actually didn't have our go decision for undocking. Luckily, the storm does seem to have picked a direction and is moving up the East Coast, so hopefully everyone is staying safe out there. But that does open up the opportunity for Bob and Doug to come home towards a primary landing site pretty close to Pensacola. That's the primary landing site, and there's a backup landing site actually near Panama City, also off the coast of Florida.
And this was no rush to come home today. This was really the beginning of opportunities for Crew Dragon Endeavour to bring Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley back to Earth. And so over the past several days, we've gotten weather updates, weather reports, even up to the time that Crew Dragon was undocking. We were looking at meteorologists providing weather reports on what we could expect in the next 24 hours, really, in the Gulf. And so the astronauts could have stayed aboard the International Space Station if that weather turned out looking nasty in the Gulf. But it looks like everything is going to be clear, and we should get nice splashdown tomorrow.
And of course, still no rush. The crews aboard, we're continuously performing weather monitoring on the landing sites. We get those reports, I think, about every 6 hours. And so if something were to turn up unexpectedly, poor weather, of course, we always have the opportunity to do a deorbit wave off. And so that would then set us up for our backup landing opportunity, which would be a little bit later, not quite on the same time scale, but about 2 days later. And of course, Bob and Doug have plenty of supplies on board if that were to happen. But right now, both the primary and alternate landing site looking healthy and go for splashdown attempt tomorrow.
And right now we are awaiting the next departure burn. That's scheduled at 6:14 p.m. Pacific, 1:14 a.m. GMT, and so that will round out the departure burns for the evening. We've had 3 so far. This will be the 4th. And that has brought Dragon out of the keep-out sphere, away from the approach ellipsoid. The first 2 took Dragon up and over the station, and then this next one brought it underneath, and then the last one will circularize Dragon's orbit, and it makes it roughly co-elliptic with the space station. We saw it burn like this on the way uphill as well.
And it's interesting you mentioned that this is the 4th burn, but it's called Depart Burn 3. And actually, we saw a little bit of this on the way in. So there are 3 hold points and a hold 0, 1, and 2 on the way to the International Space Station. All of those depend on the distance that you are from the space station. So it can be a little bit confusing when you consider the nomenclature here. Part of it is sort of the counting scheme. Part of it is also, are you at that point that is known as hold 0, hold 1, hold 2. So depart burn 0 being that first burn that we conducted, and then the depart burns 1 and 2 we saw earlier today, getting us out of the approach ellipsoid. And then depart burn 3 being our 4th burn of the day, if you don't count those 2 undocking burns that we saw.
And we've got another Ask NASA question. Don't forget to submit yours on Twitter with the hashtag AskNASA. This one from Blank and 195 others. So they want to know how many times a day the International Space Station flies around Earth. It is a very, very fast orbit. They see 16 sunrises and sunsets a day, so we make an orbit almost every 90 minutes. So that's a sunrise or a sunset every 45 minutes.
And Dragon actually seeing something relatively similar right now. Its rate of sunrise sunset will be a little bit faster just because it's going in a slightly lower orbit, but something similar right now. About eclipses lasting about 36 or 37 minutes, and seeing those about every 40 minutes. So we've got a question here from Merv about how we keep Dragon oriented in the proper reentry position to make sure that the heat shield is deflecting heat properly. And that's a great question. The spacecraft actually will have some aerodynamic forces on it. So part of the way that the spacecraft is packed will have the aerodynamic forces balancing with the force of gravity on its center of gravity, which really just depends on the sum of all of the mass in the spacecraft. And so that'll help it it orient in the correct direction. It's designed aerodynamically to put the heat shield down. And for small correction maneuvers, we'll actually be able to use the Draco thrusters to provide small orientation burns while we're going through reentry. And then once we actually get through the reentry portion of the mission and get to drogue deployment, the positioning of the